You've laid down. The world outside has quieted, and yet something inside you has only just begun to stir. There are questions that don't want answers, only attention, only stillness. Tonight, you won't be running from thoughts. You'll be following them, down the long, dark hallway of the mind, where shadows stretch and silence breathes. What you're about to hear isn't meant to disturb you, but it might awaken something that usually sleeps when you do. 50 paradoxes, each a whisper from a place just beyond reason. Not to explain the world, but to remind you how little of it you've truly seen. So let the night deepen. Let your mind dissolve into the dark. And if you find yourself drifting, drift not away from the questions, but into them. You're safe here, but you may never leave the same. It began as a whisper, a single idea, small, harmless, almost elegant in its simplicity. What if none of this is real? Not the first time it was asked, not the last. But this time the thought didn't dissolve with sleep. It didn't retreat behind tasks, screens, or laughter. It stayed. It followed him through the halls of daily life like a quiet shadow, present in every reflection, behind every idle moment. The thinker became aware of the thought, and in that awareness, something reversed. It was no longer he who was thinking. It was the thought that had begun to think him. This is the paradox. A thought, an abstraction, a flicker, should be a tool, an extension of a conscious being. But what happens when a thought no longer needs its host? What happens when an idea becomes recursive, folding in on itself until it consumes the mind that birthed it? He began to question everything. Did he choose to get out of bed that morning, or had the thought already planned it? Was his hunger real, or just a biological echo wrapped in illusion? Were his memories truly his, or stitched together by the logic of a thought that was rewriting the narrative of his life? He looked in the mirror and wondered, who is looking back? The thinker, or the thought pretending to be the thinker? This is where most stop. They brush it off, distract themselves, go outside, breathe, laugh. But he couldn't. The thought had found its home. It had taken root, not as a question, but as a framework. And slowly, everything filtered through it. Friends became actors in a performance he didn't audition for. Choices felt like scenes in a play he couldn't rewrite. The present stopped feeling real, and the future felt like a memory waiting to correct itself. And still, the thought whispered, what if you're not living in the world, but in the consequences of a thought you can't unthink? It wasn't madness. It was clarity, so sharp it burned. He began to see the world not as it was, but as the thought shaped it. Each moment, each sensation was now filtered, translated, interpreted, not lived, because you can't live fully inside a question. And once the question becomes your identity, what's left of you? The thinker had become a container, a vessel for an idea too large to hold. And yet, this paradox isn't just his, it's ours. Because every night, as we fall asleep, we surrender to thoughts we didn't invite. They rise like fog, soft at first, then total. We wonder about time, death, truth, others, ourselves, and in that wandering, some thoughts stay. They refuse to be just visitors. They want to rewrite the walls, and we let them. Thoughts are not just things. They are architects, and some build homes with no doors. So what was the original thought really? Was it simply doubt, or was it the first key turned in the lock? The thinker believed he had control, but the moment he gave the thought power, the roles reversed. And now, somewhere, maybe in a room like yours, someone else lies awake, wondering, not about the world, but about the thought that just entered. What if this is not your thought at all? What if it came to trap you too? The paradox is not that a thought can question reality. The paradox is that, in doing so, it replaces it. It does not ask for permission. It simply waits until you believe it. And then, it becomes the only thing that's real. He remembered the moment he died, not as an experience, but as a sensation. The silence, the stillness, the release. And then, something else. A flicker, a presence, a strange sense of being awake, but not alive. There was no pain, no light, no tunnel, just awareness, thin, unanchored, drifting. At first he thought it was memory, that his brain was running out of oxygen, playing a final loop of illusions. But it didn't fade. In fact, it sharpened. He was dead, but not gone. And that was the beginning of the paradox. Because what is death, if not the great exit? What happens when the door closes, and yet you remain standing in the hallway? Time passed, but not in the way it once did. There were no clocks, no sunrises, no heartbeats to measure it. Only change, subtle shifts in the silence, echoes of moments that shouldn't exist. He felt things he couldn't describe, the memory of heat without a body, the presence of thoughts that didn't belong to him. A constant hum, like the universe was breathing, but refusing to exhale. And then, the realization. Death was not an end. It was a state, and he was stuck in it, not in torment, not in bliss, just stuck. A loop without, rewind, an exile from sensation, a stillness that kept reintroducing itself. The more he waited for something, reincarnation, reunion, release, the more he began to understand. There was no next step. This was the next step. He hadn't been forgotten. He hadn't been judged. He had simply outlived the idea of death itself, and that was the punishment, or the gift. Because if death refuses to end, what does that make you? Not a soul, not a memory, something else. An echo with agency, a thought that didn't dissolve. You see, in life, we define death as a line, before and after, light and dark, something that separates the story from its ending. But what if death has no line? What if it's a spiral? What if, instead of disappearing, we simply slip into a version of ourselves that can no longer act, but can still be? He tried to forget. He tried to sleep, ironically, as we all do in life to escape life. But there was no sleep in death, only silence and awareness. And then one day, if you could still call it a day, he heard something, not a sound, not a voice, a presence, something new. You're not the only one. That was the first time he felt movement. Not his own, but something approaching. A ripple in the void, a signal in the static. It wasn't salvation, it wasn't terror, it was recognition. Someone else was here. Another consciousness caught in the loop. Another life that had died and never stopped. And that's when he understood the real paradox. Death wasn't the end. It was the space between lives that never ended either. Not a conclusion, not a reward, not a punishment. A room with mirrors instead of walls, with echoes instead of doors, with no ceiling, no floor, only reflections of every moment you tried to escape and failed to. Maybe that's why some fear death so deeply, not because of the unknown, but because of the still known, because we're not afraid of ending. We're afraid of continuing when nothing else does, and maybe, just maybe, you've been here before. Maybe the dream you keep having, the one with the hallway, the hum, the heaviness, is not a dream at all. It's your memory of the time you died and didn't. At first, it looked like an ordinary mirror, a tall, slender pane set in a plain black frame, tucked into the corner of an antique shop no one remembered entering. Dustless, cold, too still. And when he looked into it, he saw himself, but not as he was, as he would be, older, paler, eyes dimmed by years he hadn't lived yet. His jaw trembled. His reflection didn't. He blinked. It didn't. He turned to leave. It stayed, watching. That was when he knew. This mirror wasn't reflecting him. It was remembering him from the future. This is the paradox. A mirror that doesn't show you now, but who you will become, whether you want to or not. He returned the next day, and the next. Each time, the image was slightly different. A different shirt he didn't own. A cut on the cheek he didn't have. Eyes more tired, smile more distant. A story he hadn't lived. Yet. He began trying to change the reflection, smiling when he didn't feel like it, lifting his chin, fixing his posture. But the man in the mirror resisted. He never smiled back. Sometimes he looked sad. Sometimes afraid. Once he was crying. The more he tried to escape the mirror, the more it followed him. He would catch its shape in puddles, in windows, in strangers' sunglasses, and always that future self, watching, waiting. But for what, he wondered? Was the mirror showing his destiny or creating it? He tried to test it, shaving his beard, cutting his hair, moving to a new city. But the mirror stayed consistent. It knew. Even before he did. He even stopped looking into it, boarded it up, buried it in a closet. But the image stayed in his mind. That future face, aging in silence, still waiting for him to arrive. And one night, in the kind of dream that doesn't feel like sleep, he saw it again. But this time, the mirror spoke. It didn't use words, it used knowing. And the message was clear. You think you are watching yourself, but it is I who am watching you. Because what is a mirror really? Is it just a reflection? Or is it a frame? A screen showing not the world, but a version of it that expects you. The more he thought about it, the more terrifying the truth became. The man in the mirror wasn't him. Not exactly. It was a possibility, one that had gained momentum through observation. A version of himself that grew stronger every time he stared into it and accepted it. You see, that's the curse of the mirror that reflects the future. It doesn't just show what might happen, it dares you to become it, and punishes you with the fear that no matter what you choose, the reflection already knows. He started seeing it in others, how they stared into glass surfaces just a little too long, as if waiting for permission or confirmation, as if asking, is this really who I'll become? And the worst part is, the more they looked, the more the answer became yes. Because the paradox isn't just that the mirror reflects the future, it's that the reflection becomes the architect, the watcher becomes the creator. And you become the memory of a choice you never made. So the next time you catch your own eyes in passing, in a window, in a screen, in a reflection you didn't mean to meet, pause and ask yourself, is that truly you looking back? Or is it the version of you that's already waiting for you to surrender? Who are you? No, not your name, not your face, not the roles you play when others are watching, not the voice you use when you pick up the phone, not the smile you wear in photographs, the real you, the one behind the eyes, the one you talk to when no one else is around, that you. But what if that you was never really yours? That's where this paradox begins. You were born into a story already in motion. You inherited expectations before you spoke your first word. You were given a name before you could form a thought. You learned how to be you by watching others decide what you meant. You were taught how to smile, how to answer, how to behave. You were shaped like clay, and then told you were whole. But somewhere deep inside, before memory, before language, there was a version of you that had no name, only awareness, only presence, and it got buried beneath all the versions you were forced to perform. So here's the paradox. You walk through the world wearing a self that isn't really you. It's a construct, a reflection, a mask that's been sculpted by every eye that ever looked at you, every opinion that ever landed on your skin like dust. You feel real. But are you? Are you thinking your own thoughts? Or are you recycling ones you've heard from others? Voices that echo long after their mouths have gone silent. Do you really like what you like? Or were you praised for liking it early on? So you learned to keep liking it. Do you truly believe what you believe? Or was it handed to you, wrapped in culture, fear, tradition? What if you've never actually met yourself? People say they're trying to find themselves, but you can't find what was never lost. You can only peel back what was never yours. To begin with, he tried to do that. He stopped speaking for a week. He left the city. He stopped responding to his name. He wanted to meet the self behind the scaffolding. At first, there was silence, then discomfort, then something terrifying. Nothingness, not peace, not clarity, just a void where he expected something sacred, a who that wasn't there. It wasn't enlightenment, it was collapse. Because beneath the masks, he found more masks. The truth began to dawn slowly, like moonlight on water. There was no fixed self, no core identity waiting to be unveiled, just layers of impressions, reactions, dreams and defenses. And still, he kept going, not to find the self, but to let go of needing one. That's the real paradox. You are not a single you. You are a flicker, a constantly shifting narrative told by neurons and reinforced by memory. You are a performance, and the audience is mostly gone. You are not the mask, but you are not what's under it either, because the act of removing the mask is just another mask. And yet, in that terrifying realization, there's freedom, because if you were never fixed, you are never trapped. You can become something else, not by finding yourself, but by realizing you were never anyone in the first place. Just presence, just breath, just awareness flickering through temporary forms. So the next time someone asks who you are, pause. Don't answer right away. Watch how many selves rise up to respond, and ask yourself, who gave them permission to speak for me? Because maybe the most honest answer is silence. Time has always been described as a line, a forward arrow, a journey from past to present to future, a rhythm that pushes everything onward, birth to death, sunrise to sunset, cause to effect. But what if the arrow turned? What if time circled back not to repeat itself, but to consume its own origin. That's where this paradox begins. There was once a physicist who studied time not as a measurement, but as a phenomenon. He believed time had weight, that every moment added pressure to reality, like gravity pulling on the spine of the universe. He tracked entropy, the slow unraveling of order. He mapped it like a current, a tide moving toward disorder, until one day his instruments recorded something strange. A drop, not in temperature, not in light, but in causality. Events were still unfolding, but their beginnings were gone. The candle burned, but there was no record of it being lit. The wheel turned, but no one recalled the push. The equations still balanced, but the origins of the variables had vanished. Something had begun eating the past, not erasing it, not rewriting it, devouring it. He called it temporal inversion, but it wasn't time reversing. It was time undoing its own steps while continuing forward, like walking through a doorway and finding the floor behind you disintegrating, not from wear but from deliberate forgetting. And then he realized it wasn't just happening around him, it was happening to him. He would begin a sentence and forget why he started it. He'd feel grief, but not remember the loss. Memories remained, but the logic behind them faded. Moments had no roots. He was living inside the effect, with no cause to hold it up. That's when it hit him. Time wasn't a sequence, it was a mouth, and the present was its tongue, licking away at the beginning while whispering the illusion of forward motion. This is the paradox. We believe we're moving from start to finish, but maybe the start has already been eaten, and we're walking through a story that no longer has a first page. You've felt it, haven't you? Those moments when you suddenly forget how you got where you are, not just physically, but emotionally, like waking up inside a decision you didn't see coming, like knowing the words, but forgetting the thought that led to them. Sometimes it's brushed off as tiredness, sometimes anxiety, but maybe it's time fraying at the edges, the illusion of a beginning dissolving while you live the middle. Because here's the hidden truth. Time doesn't need a start to continue. It only needs you to believe in now, and once it has that, it can eat whatever came before. It becomes the perfect predator, silent, slow, polite, feeding not on flesh, but on foundations, leaving you in a world that seems unchanged, until you realize the roots are gone. So what happens if time devours everything that led to you? Do you still exist, or are you just the echo of something that once did? A ripple left behind by a vanishing cause. The physicist kept writing, kept documenting, but each page felt thinner, each theory more uncertain. And then one day, his work was found. Charts, notes, calculations, but no name, no date, no trace of the person who made them. As if he had been devoured along with the beginning, he tried to understand. And maybe that's the final lesson. Time doesn't just take away youth or chances or lives. It eats backwards. It removes the question and leaves only the answer. It erases the reason and leaves only the result. And by the time you notice, it's already too late to ask how you got here, because that part is gone. There was once a light so bright it couldn't be seen. It didn't shine outward. It didn't illuminate its surroundings. It existed in silence, glowing inside a cage of its own making. This was no ordinary light. It didn't flicker. It didn't fade. It simply burned endlessly within itself, looping, folding, reflecting inward until it became both flame and prison. This is where the paradox begins. We are taught that light is the symbol of clarity, of revelation, that it travels, it spreads, it touches everything it sees. But what if there was a kind of light that couldn't move forward? What if its path curved back into itself, endlessly, creating a radiance that no one could witness? This light wasn't trapped by darkness. It wasn't swallowed by black holes. It was trapped by its own intensity. Too much awareness, too much knowing, so much energy that it collapsed the very space that carried it. Some physicists call this a photon sphere, a theoretical zone near a black hole where light bends into orbit and becomes locked in an eternal spiral, not escaping, not vanishing, just spinning, forever, around a gravitational truth it cannot deny. But the metaphor goes deeper. Imagine a mind that knows too much, a consciousness so hyper-aware, so flooded with its own reflections, that it can no longer move freely. It begins to turn inward, thoughts circling thoughts, questions birthing questions, awareness folding in on itself until the self is no longer seen by others, only felt, dimly, from within. That's the curse of the light that can't escape itself. It shines, but only in isolation. It is brilliance without witness, truth without translation. You've felt this before, haven't you? Those moments when your clarity becomes paralyzing, when you understand so deeply that action becomes impossible. You don't move forward because you can see every path, and every ending, and every failure. Your insight becomes your weight. Your knowing becomes your cage, because light that cannot leave itself cannot touch the world. He was once a philosopher, the man who lived with this light. People came to him for answers, and he gave them none. Not because he didn't know, but because he saw too far. He saw the cost of every explanation, the distortion that follows every truth, the echo that replaces the voice. So he stopped speaking, he stopped writing, and eventually he stopped looking outward altogether. People called him mad, said he had vanished, but he hadn't. He was still there, just orbiting himself, burning so brightly in his own mind that the rest of the world faded to silhouettes. And this is what terrified them. Not that he was gone, but that he was still thinking, still seeing, still glowing in silence. Because what happens when brilliance becomes isolation? What happens when the light that was meant to reveal refuses to leave the mirror? This paradox lives in many of us. We chase insight, we pursue clarity, we worship awareness. But there's a threshold, a point where knowing becomes confinement, where understanding becomes a hall of mirrors, where the light you sought to follow becomes the labyrinth you can't escape. And the world, it continues, unaware that you've become a lighthouse with no windows, a beacon shining only inward. So what do you do? Do you dim the light? Lie to yourself just enough to function again? Or do you burn quietly in your own orbit, hoping that one day someone else might feel your heat? Because the light that cannot escape itself isn't dead. It's not evil. It's not even tragic. It's just alone, a paradox. Not because it failed to shine, but because it shined too much, in a place too small to hold it. And maybe, just maybe, that's you. Not broken, not lost, just orbiting, waiting for the gravity to weaken, or for someone brave enough to reach in. He had a voice once, one that spoke softly, thoughtfully, one that carried laughter, anger, stories, truths. But over time, something began to change. At first, his words echoed in the air like they always had. But people stopped responding. They looked through him as if his mouth were moving, but no sound escaped. He tried speaking louder, slower, with more force. But it didn't matter. He still had thoughts, still had meaning. But somewhere between his intention and the world, the sound had disappeared. This is the paradox. A voice that speaks, but cannot be heard. Not because it lacks volume, but because the world has stopped listening. We assume that to speak is to be known, that once we give something words, it becomes real. But what if the world can reject meaning before it even forms? What if silence isn't the absence of speech, but the collapse of reception? He screamed once, in a crowded street, in a room full of friends, in a dream where everything moved but nothing responded. And the silence that followed was not peaceful. It was terrifying, because silence isn't always quiet. Sometimes silence is what remains when your existence becomes background noise. He began to wonder, if no one hears you, do you still exist? Are you still real if your voice passes through people like wind through trees? He started writing his thoughts down, in notebooks, on walls. He typed them into machines, but even the paper began to feel hollow, as if his words dissolved the moment they were formed. And one night, he realized, his voice hadn't stopped working. The world had simply stopped responding. The silence wasn't his, it was theirs. A wall built of distraction, apathy, noise. But the deeper realization was worse. It wasn't just others. He had stopped listening to himself. He spoke out of habit, answered without presence, thought without meaning, reflected without depth. He had become a speaker in an empty room, hoping someone else would step in to give his words shape. This is the tragedy of the voice that speaks without sound. It says everything and is still forgotten. How many of us are like him? We say we're okay when we're not. We say we're listening, but we're scrolling. We speak without presence. We respond without hearing. So the words pile up, unheard, unlived, unfelt, and eventually, the voice inside us begins to question whether it should speak at all. But here's the strange hope buried in the paradox. Sometimes the loudest voice is the one unspoken. The glance, the stillness, the held breath before the confession. And maybe, just maybe, the voice that no one hears is the one the world needs most. Because when you can no longer depend on sound, you begin to speak with intention, with weight, with silence that means something. He never got his voice back, not in the way others expected. But one day, someone sat beside him and said nothing. They just listened. And for the first time in years, he felt heard. Because some voices live in sound. Others live in silence, and the truest ones live in the space between the two. The mind is the most convincing liar you'll ever know, and its favorite trick is pretending it's real. It begins with a feeling, not sight, not sound, not memory, just the strange sensation that you exist, that you are someone, somewhere, inside a stream of thoughts. But stop and ask, what are you, really? A body? A name? A collection of reactions strung together by habits and memory? Or are you a dream that hasn't realized it's still dreaming? This is the paradox. The mind can simulate everything: sight, sound, hunger, pain, even time. It can create entire worlds when you sleep. It can convince you that a nightmare is reality, that falling without falling is real. that people who don't exist are familiar. So, what happens if it does that? While you're awake? He lived an ordinary life, or so he thought. Routine, family, a job. But it all began to feel off, not broken, just fabricated. He couldn't trace memories back to a moment. The edges of time felt soft. The people around him said the right things, did the expected things. But he couldn't shake the feeling they were reading from a script. And then came the dreams. Except they didn't start when he closed his eyes. They started while he was brushing his teeth, while he was driving, while he was talking, blending seamlessly, whispers in his own voice, moments that echoed before they happened. The real and the unreal began to touch. At first, he thought he was losing his mind. But what if? He had never found it to begin with. He began to question. What if this waking life was just another layer of sleep? What if his mind had created all of this, not to deceive him, but to protect itself? After all, consciousness is fragile. The mind wants to survive, even if that means building a prison that looks like freedom. Imagine a dream so deep it builds its own language, its own laws of physics, its own version of you, complete with flaws, history, ambition. Now imagine never waking up from it, would, you know? You wouldn't. Because everything inside it would be telling you that you're awake, that this moment is real, that these thoughts are yours, and every attempt to question that would be met with a mental wall, a distraction, a logical explanation that wraps you back in comfort. You would defend the dream. You would call it reality, and that's what he feared most. Not that he was dreaming, but that if he ever woke up, there would be nothing there. Because if the mind created this world to survive, then outside the dream, there might be no you at all. Just silence. Just the faint memory of a thought that once dreamed it was alive. So he stopped asking. He went back to work. He smiled at his family. He let the dream do what it was made to do. But every now and then, in the quiet moments, in the space between blinks, he feels it again. The texture of unreality, the code behind the color, the flicker in the sky that shouldn't be there, the glitch in the face of a stranger, and he wonders, was this whole life his invention or someone else's dream? Because the mind is not loyal to truth, it is loyal to continuity. And if the story works, it doesn't care if it's real, it just wants to keep dreaming. He thought freedom meant no limits, no rules, no weight. He imagined it as space, endless, silent, waiting to be filled. He thought if he could just tear down every wall, he'd finally breathe. But when the last door opened, he found himself more lost than ever. No one to stop him, no reason to move, no direction to walk in, just choice. This is the paradox. Freedom, in its purest form, doesn't feel like liberation. It feels like suffocation. When everything is possible, nothing has meaning. And when nothing has meaning, why move at all? He began to feel the weight of empty space, every path available, every desire acceptable, every rule bendable. And in that perfect openness, he froze. We chase freedom like a cure. We think if we remove control, we'll find joy. But freedom without structure is like an open ocean with no shore. You drift, you ache, you begin to long for the very thing you escaped. He remembered the boundaries he used to hate, schedules, expectations, deadlines. They weren't cages, They were context. They gave his actions consequence, his time meaning. Now he could do anything. And so he did nothing. He stayed in his room. He paced. He thought. And then one day he did something strange. He locked the door, not to keep anyone out, but to keep himself in. It wasn't fear, it was focus. And in that act, he found something he hadn't felt since he was free. Intention. He chose the lock. He chose the limit. And in doing so, he rediscovered motion. Because true freedom isn't the absence of walls. It's the power to build the right ones. Freedom without direction is chaos. Freedom with intention is clarity. You've felt this too, haven't you? A day with no plan feels like escape, until it becomes weightless. A life with no structure feels infinite, until it begins to unravel. So we build rituals, boundaries. We say no to some things, so we can say yes to others. That isn't weakness, it's wisdom. The irony is, the more we define our lives, the freer we feel inside them. Not because we are trapped, but because we are anchored. The man who thought he wanted to float forever discovered he needed gravity, and so do you. Freedom is not doing anything you want. It's knowing why you want it, and choosing to pursue it, even if it means closing every other door, because too many open doors become a hallway with no home. And now, he still locks the door sometimes, not out of fear, but out of devotion, to the path he's chosen, to the limits that make meaning possible. He is free, not because he has no chains, but because he chose the ones he wears. She remembered the room. The wallpaper had tiny blue flowers. There was a humming sound, steady, gentle, almost melodic. Someone was speaking softly near the window. The light outside was fading, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. It felt so vivid, so detailed, so real. And yet, it had never happened. There were no photos. No one she asked recalled it. She had never lived in a house with wallpaper like that. And the voice? Unrecognizable. Still, the memory returned often. When she was tired, when she was safe, when her mind grew quiet. And every time, it brought the same sense of longing, as if she'd left something behind in a place that didn't exist. This is the paradox. How can you remember something that never happened? A moment that feels older than you, a scene that lives in your mind with no origin, emotion without source, nostalgia for an event that time forgot to record. Memory is supposed to be evidence, proof that something occurred. But sometimes the mind doesn't need proof. It just needs meaning, and meaning doesn't care about facts. We trust our memories more than anything. We build identities from them. We choose love, fear, faith because of them. But memory isn't a photograph. It's a story, and stories can be written without witnesses. She tried to find the source: old journals, childhood photos, medical records, nothing. Still, the memory grew stronger. It began to bleed into her dreams. She'd walk through that room, hear the same voice, feel the same ache. Like something unfinished had followed her from a world that had never existed. Was it a dream? A fabrication? A leftover from a past life, if such things are possible? Or was it planted? Not by another person, but by her own mind, in a moment of vulnerability or need. Because the brain doesn't just store memories, it creates them. It rearranges and invents, blending fact with fiction so seamlessly that even truth becomes questionable. Think of déjà vu, that strange echo of familiarity in a place you've never been. Is it a glitch in memory, or a reminder from something deeper. Now ask yourself, what if some of your strongest memories never happened? What if the version of you trust most was built on something imagined? Does that make you less real, or just more human? We all carry false memories, but what makes them powerful isn't their accuracy. It's their effect. That moment you think shaped you might be an illusion, but if it changed you, if it moved you, if it made you weep or heal or forgive, then does it matter? Maybe the mind invents moments because reality doesn't always give us what we need. And in that invention, we find what reality couldn't provide. A lesson, a closure, a piece of ourselves. She stopped searching after a while, not because she gave up, but because she made peace with the idea that not all memories come from time. Some come from truth, but not the kind you can prove. And that room, it still visits her, but now she welcomes it, not as a ghost, but as a mirror, a memory of a self she never was, but still needed to become. Because sometimes, the most important things we remember are the ones that never happened. In the beginning, if there ever truly was one, there was awareness, not shaped by flesh, not defined by name, just a presence, all-knowing, all-encompassing. Everything that could be already was. And this awareness, vast and unbound, had no fear, no desire, no movement, only stillness, only being, until it asked a question. What would it feel like to forget myself? And with that question, the paradox was born. The awareness fractured, not out of pain, but out of curiosity. To experience wonder, it had to forget omniscience. To feel discovery, it had to lose memory. To know joy, it had to taste sorrow. And so, it scattered. Across time, across form, across consciousness, into planets, into lives, into you. This is the paradox. A God, complete, eternal, unshakable, forgot what it was, and became us. All of us, not separate gods, but fragments, dreaming we are small, confused, searching, grasping for truth in mirrors and meaning in stars. He lived a life like anyone else, born with questions, raised with stories, haunted by longings he couldn't name. He prayed, like many do, asked for signs, begged for answers, never realizing the voice he was reaching for was the echo of his own, distant, distorted, but still there. It came to him in silence, not as a revelation, but as a quiet knowing. I am what I seek. The prayers, the fears, the dreams, they weren't reaching outward. They were echoes trying to loop inward, to wake something ancient within him. But the forgetting was too deep. He cried. He screamed. He meditated for hours in darkness. And still, the veil held firm. Because the paradox is this: to remember what you are, you must surrender the you that believes it is separate. But surrendering that you feels like death. Who are you without your pain? Your memories? Your voice? Would you be willing to let it all go, just to glimpse a truth you might never be able to speak? The God that forgot itself did not fall. It volunteered. And you are not a mistake. You are a question the divine asked itself. A risk it took to see beauty from the inside. A story it whispered into form, and then listened to. So when you feel the pull of something more, when your dreams echo with places you've never been, when a sunset feels like recognition instead of scenery. That is the remembering. Faint, but rising. You are not just alive, you are remembering life from both sides. And maybe, just maybe, what we call awakening isn't becoming something greater. It's simply realizing we were never anything less. The God hasn't vanished. He hasn't been silent. He is dreaming through you, through all of us. And one day, when enough of us remember, the dream will shift and the God will awaken, not above us, not beyond us, but as us, because you were never just part of the divine. You were the part that chose to forget, so it could be found again. In the world we know, shadows are simple. A lack of light, an effect of an object blocking the sun, the lamp, the flame. They follow, they echo, they depend. They cannot exist first. But this is not the world we know. This is where the paradox begins. He saw it for the first time on a cracked sidewalk at dusk, a shadow, distinct, sharp, lying across the pavement. But there was nothing there to cast it. No tree, no person, no shape, only the absence of light and the eerie sense that something was missing. He waited, watching, expecting something to arrive, but nothing came. Instead, the shadow deepened, as if growing more certain of itself, more solid than the world around it. The next day, the shadow appeared again, and the day after that, until one morning, the object arrived. A sculpture, black metal, twisted and smooth, installed by a city crew who had no memory of its commission. It cast the same shape he had seen days before. Only now it made sense. Or did it? Because how could a shadow appear before the thing that created it? This is the paradox. A shadow, the dependent, the follower, not only arriving first, but causing its source. What if the effect comes before the cause? What if darkness isn't the absence of presence, but the first sign of it? He began seeing it everywhere. A coldness in a room before the window cracked open. An echo before the word was spoken. A regret before the mistake was made. Like reality was rippling in reverse. As if what he felt in the moment wasn't what was, but what would be. And once you see the shadow before the object, you start to question everything. Memories begin to feel like predictions. Choices feel pre-written. Pain arrives in anticipation of a future blow. He began to feel watched. Not by someone above, but by something behind. The shadow, not cast by light, but by possibility. He wondered, could a shadow be a warning? A sign of something we're not yet ready to face? Or worse, could it be the architect? Maybe the object didn't create the shadow. Maybe the shadow demanded form. Maybe it shaped the world in its own silhouette. And if that's true, what does that say about our lives? Are the dark moments simply consequences? Or are they the blueprint? Does sadness arrive because something happened? Or does something happen because we've already begun to feel the sadness? We think of shadows as passive, but what if they are not? What if the unseen is more real than the seen? What if what you feel in your bones before it makes sense in your mind is the truest signal there is? And what if the universe, like that shadow, moves from silence to sound, from emptiness to shape, from consequence back to cause? He stopped fearing the shadows. Instead, he began to read them, not as omens, but as introductions, as first drafts of the future. Soft blueprints sketched in darkness, not to be avoided, but understood, because some things arrive before they can be seen. Some truths cast themselves in reverse. And when you walk through life thinking you are chasing clarity, you may discover it is the shadow that is chasing you. He entered the room expecting quiet. No voices, no machines, no wind, just stillness. And yet, the silence was deafening. It pressed on his ears. It buzzed behind his thoughts. It vibrated, not with sound, but with weight. He felt his pulse, in his throat. His breath felt too loud. Even blinking sounded wrong. This wasn't peace. It was pressure, not the absence of sound, but the presence of something deeper. This is the paradox. Silence isn't always empty. Sometimes it is so full, it becomes louder than anything else. We think of noise as disruption, and silence as the opposite. But in reality, silence is never truly silent. It's layered, alive, echoing with things unsaid. In that room, he realized the silence wasn't around him. It was inside him. Every memory he hadn't processed, every word he didn't speak, every emotion he had buried under polite smiles and busy days, they all lived there, in the silence, and now they were screaming. He had run from noise his whole life. Headphones, TV, music, conversations that didn't matter just to fill the void, because quiet made him uncomfortable. Now he understood why. Silence wasn't empty. It was where the truth waited. You can drown out everything else, but you can't escape your own echo. And sometimes the echo grows. Louder with each year you avoid it. It waits in corners, in the final 5 minutes before sleep, in long car rides, in elevator rides, in moments between words. Silence doesn't forget. It just waits. He sat in that room for hours, not because he wanted to, but because he couldn't leave. The silence held him there. It forced him to listen to everything he had been avoiding. The apology he never made. The grief he never mourned. The question he never asked. And in that unbearable quiet, he felt the full weight of existence. Not the noise of it, but the truth of it. This is why silence can be so terrifying. Not because it is empty, but because it is honest. Sound gives us stories. Silence gives us mirrors, and most of us aren't ready to see what's looking back. He once believed silence was peaceful. Now he knew it was powerful, because in a world drowning in distraction, silence is confrontation. You against yourself, the truth against your noise, and the longer you run from it, the louder it becomes. We all carry silences like ticking clocks, moments we never faced, futures we never spoke aloud, truths we never gave air, and when the world goes quiet, those clocks start to tick, not with sound, but with meaning. So if you ever find yourself in a moment where everything goes still, don't panic, don't run, just listen, because the silence isn't punishing you, it's inviting you back to yourself, and that scream you hear inside it, that isn't fear, it's truth, and it's been waiting for you to hear it. He had always believed in choice, that life was a blank page, and every step he took was ink under his control, that if he wanted to change his future, he just had to act differently. Then came the dream. In it, he saw his life play out in reverse, moments he hadn't reached yet, people he hadn't met, mistakes he hadn't made, but felt the weight of all the same. And when he woke up, he knew exactly what was coming. The problem was, nothing he did could stop it. He tried to change his route to work, avoided certain conversations, made opposite choices just to prove he had free will. And still, the dream unfolded exactly as he'd seen. The same words were spoken, the same faces appeared, the same silence followed his resistance. That's when he began to suspect the truth. This wasn't a path he could alter by avoiding it. It was a destiny that would only change if he followed it. This is the paradox. You can only rewrite your future by walking directly into it, not around it, not away from it, through it. He had to let the path complete itself before it could bend. Every time he resisted it, the story snapped back into place. Like a river, he tried to dam with bare hands. But the moment he surrendered to the dream, something changed. He spoke the words he feared. He met the person he tried to avoid. He stood exactly where he was supposed to stand. And instead of being trapped in fate, he felt something shift. Not outside, but inside. He had moved beyond repetition into transformation. The universe had been waiting for his participation, not his rebellion. Because destiny is not always a chain. Sometimes it is a code, one that must be fully entered before it can unlock new doors. You've felt it, haven't you? Moments in life where every choice felt forced, where no matter what you did, you ended up in the same emotional place. The same kind of relationship, the same kind of failure. Not because you were cursed, but because you hadn't walked all the way through the story. You stopped at discomfort. You turned at fear. You resisted what was meant to burn you clean. He learned that fate isn't always the final draft. Sometimes it's just the first chapter. But it must be read before you're allowed to write the next. Free will doesn't mean never having a path. It means choosing how to walk it with resistance or with purpose. The man in the dream kept going, not because he had no choice, but because he finally understood that the only way out was deeper in, and at the very end, where he expected loss, where the dream had always ended in silence. He spoke. He changed one sentence, one word, and the ending unraveled like thread. He woke up with tears in his eyes, not because he was free, but because he finally knew what freedom meant. Not the absence of destiny, but the power to meet it with eyes wide open. So if your life feels scripted, if your choices feel like reruns, don't assume you're powerless. Maybe you're just halfway through the dream, and the only way to change it is to live it fully. Not as a prisoner, but as the one who rewrites the ending by finally being present for the middle. It was an old clock. Rust on the hands, dust in the gears, a silent heirloom hanging on the wall of an empty study. He never gave it much thought, until the second hand moved backward. At first, he assumed it was broken, a glitch, mechanical fatigue. But the minute hand followed, then the hour. Tick by reverse tick, the clock began unwinding its own story. He tried resetting it, tried winding it forward, tried replacing the batteries, even though it was spring-powered. Still, it moved backward, patiently, precisely. But this was no ordinary malfunction. As the hours reversed, so did the air in the room. The dust on the shelf settled back into the ceiling. The smell of coffee retreated into the mug. His thoughts began looping, repeating in reverse order. He wasn't just watching time reverse. He was in it. This is the paradox. What happens when time no longer moves forward? When progress turns to regression? When you live each moment backward, but still remember moving forward? He remembered getting up from the chair and then felt himself sit back down. He remembered closing the book, and then saw his hands open it once more. But here's what truly unsettled him. He could still feel choice. He was aware of the reversal, but powerless to stop it, powerless to steer it. It wasn't like a dream. It was like watching the river run uphill while still trying to swim. Each day, his memories unstitched themselves. He forgot phone calls, forgot arguments, forgot love, but not all at once. Just enough to know he had once felt them. He began to mourn things he hadn't lost yet. He wept for endings that had already passed, and were now unraveling before his eyes. He watched himself fall out of love, unlearn trust, lose meaning. But strangely, there was peace, because going backward revealed something he had missed, how much he had overlooked while moving forward. He saw conversations he had once ignored, gestures he had forgotten, moments he had rushed past, now blooming in reverse. He began to wonder, had time always been moving forward, or had we only assumed it did? Maybe we don't move through time. Maybe time moves through us, and it doesn't care about direction. What if time loops, folds, and sways? What if forward is just the way we narrate chaos? And what if the clock, the ordinary clock, was not breaking, but revealing? What if the reverse movement was not an error, but a memory, a trace of how the universe folds into itself before starting again? He stopped trying to fix the clock. He let it run backward, and he watched. And as it ticked toward nothing, he began to feel everything, each moment richer, heavier, stripped of expectation. There was no next, only now, and then just before now. Eventually, the clock wound down completely. The hands met at midnight and stopped. No sound, no motion, just stillness. He stared at it for a long time. Then, without warning, the second hand ticked forward, just once, enough to remind him. Time may reverse, it may stop, it may lose direction, but you are still the witness. And that is the deepest paradox of all, that even when time moves backward, you are still here, watching it unfold, not broken, not confused, just aware. So the next time a moment feels like it's repeating, or you feel yourself slipping into déjà vu, don't resist it. Maybe you're not behind. Maybe time is catching up to a version of you that always knew direction is an illusion, presence is the truth. She always believed the soul was sacred, something ancient, something eternal, a spark placed within by something higher, something beyond. But one day, that belief cracked. It started with a question, simple, almost innocent. What if your soul wasn't given, but built? Not gifted by a god, not carried from another life, but assembled, piece by piece, thought by thought, memory by memory. The idea haunted her. She began to trace her identity backward. What did she love? What did she fear? What had shaped her? So much of it came from television, from stories, from moments manufactured by others, absorbed passively. The way she laughed, the way she grieved, the way she interpreted love. Had any of it come from within, or had it all been coded? This is the paradox. What we call the soul may not be divine. It may be a construct, layered from experience, language, and exposure, a mirror reflecting everything we've absorbed and mistaking it for a self. She remembered her favorite song, realized the lyrics had shaped her concept of heartbreak before she ever loved anyone. She thought about her fear of death, realized it mimicked scenes she'd seen in films long before she'd ever contemplated mortality. She tried to find a pure version of herself, untouched, uninfluenced, but there was none. Even her inner voice was built from the voices she grew up hearing. So what then? If everything is learned, echoed, downloaded, where is the soul? Is there one at all? Or is it a story we tell ourselves to feel like more than machines? But then, she felt something else. Not fear, not despair, a strange kind of reverence. Because if the soul is built, if it's sculpted by life, then maybe that makes it even more precious. Not a gift given blindly, but a mosaic crafted through struggle, joy, and pain. Maybe a manufactured soul is more alive than one simply inherited, because it means you chose it, you survived for it, you pieced it together from every broken version of yourself and decided to keep going. She thought again of music, of stories, of conversations at 3 a.m., all those things that entered her and never left. Maybe the soul isn't what you're born with. Maybe it's what you build when you refuse to be empty. She stopped trying to find something untouched inside her. Instead, she began to love the touches, the scars, the echoes, the borrowed lines that somehow became her truth. She realized the paradox wasn't a threat. It was a revelation that if the soul was made, it could be remade. And if it was shaped by stories, she could write new ones. That's what makes us different from machines. Not that we are born with souls, but that we're capable of forming them, refining them, and sometimes redeeming them. So if you ever feel like you don't know who you are, if you fear that your soul is just a product of your past, take comfort in this. Even if it is, you're the one carrying it forward, and every step you take is another thread in its design. There was a question inside him. He'd felt it since he was young, a presence that pressed against his mind but never quite revealed itself. It didn't arrive in words, not even in pictures, just an ache, a shape of thought without form, like a song hummed by the universe that he almost recognized, but could never repeat. He tried to explain it once, to a teacher, to a friend, to a lover, but no words would hold it. Each sentence failed. Each metaphor collapsed beneath the weight of what it tried to carry. This is the paradox. A question so deep, so essential, that no language can reach it. We believe that to question is to seek understanding, that if we can name it, we can explore it. But what if the most important question can't be spoken? What if the mind is not the container for the question, but the consequence of it? He searched philosophy, science, scripture. He found echoes of the question, but never the question itself, not in the words, but in the spaces between them, not in what was said, but in what was implied, felt, then abandoned. It showed up in dreams, in déjà vu, in the pause before making a choice he didn't understand, in the pull toward places he'd never been, but missed all the same. The question was always with him, but never clear. And yet its absence shaped him. Not knowing it became the architecture of his identity. He began to ask himself, do I want to answer it? Or am I afraid of what it might reveal? Because to put words to something is to limit it, to confine the infinite within syllables, to reduce the sacred to a sentence. What if the question was never meant to be spoken? What if some truths only live in silence? Language is powerful, but it is also a boundary. It divides what we feel from what we can say. It turns experience into definition. It cages wonder in explanation. And sometimes, that ruins it. He came to realize The question inside him didn't need words. It wasn't asking to be answered. It was asking to be honored, to be held, felt, allowed, like grief, like love, like awe. Because there are things too large for language, too sacred for syntax. And maybe we've made a mistake, thinking that questions must be solved rather than lived. He stopped trying to define it. Instead, he walked with it. He let it guide him, shape him, hold him when he was tired. And over time, it became less a mystery and more a companion. Not a riddle, but a rhythm. He found others like him, people who had no words for what they were feeling. But tears welled in their eyes when he described it anyway, because they had the question too. They had always had it. But no one had ever told them that not all questions are made of words. So, if you feel something inside you that doesn't fit in a sentence, don't fear it. Don't silence it. Just stay with it. You are not broken. You are just holding a truth that language hasn't caught up to yet. And maybe in the end, the most divine things in life can only be spoken in silence. She didn't cry when it happened. No trembling, no scream, no anger, only stillness. People called her strong, said she was composed, graceful, resilient. But she wasn't any of those things. She was broken, quietly, and the silence she wore wasn't strength. It was surrender. This is the paradox. There are moments when pain becomes so deep, so wide, so complete, that it no longer feels like suffering. It feels like peace, not because it stops hurting, but because it stops moving. The sharpness dulls, the chaos settles, and what remains is a stillness that feels sacred, a calm that can't be explained, only endured. She sat in that space for days, maybe weeks. She stopped trying to name it, stopped trying to fix it, because she realized something profound. Pain is loud when we resist it, but when we accept it fully, it softens into something else, something almost beautiful. We think healing is joy, that when we feel peace, it means the wound is gone. But sometimes, peace is not the absence of pain. It is the shape pain takes when we stop fighting it. She remembered the exact moment it shifted, when the ache in her chest no longer screamed for attention, but simply existed, like a quiet room after a storm. Ruined, yes, but safe, still. And in that moment, she felt something close to truth. Because pain, when it is no longer resisted, reveals who we really are. Not what we say, not what we believe, but what we endure. We are shaped by what we survive. And sometimes that survival leaves behind a strange kind of peace. Not joy, not light, but a grounded knowing. A wisdom. She found herself speaking differently, listening longer, needing less. Her smile wasn't bright, but it was real. Her presence wasn't loud, but it was deep, because pain had carved out space in her that joy could never reach. It had opened her, quietly, completely. And this is why some people seem calm in the face of disaster. It's not denial. It's not numbness. It's the kind of peace that only comes after everything else has been stripped away. After the tears, after the pleading, after the story collapses and only the silence remains. A silence you can live in, even build from. Pain that becomes peace doesn't leave a scar. It leaves a doorway, a passage into a deeper self. She never sought the pain, but she honored it, let it sit beside her, Let it speak. And when it was ready, it stopped being a wound and became a teacher. So if you find yourself in a place where the hurt no longer burns but hums, where the ache no longer panics but settles, don't rush it. Don't run. You've arrived at the quiet edge of something sacred, not broken, not healed, just becoming. He was walking down the street when it happened. A moment so small he could have missed it. A flicker in the sky. A silence that wasn't just quiet, but absent. Like the world held its breath and then forgot how to exhale. Everything looked the same. The buildings, the cars, the sky. But something had changed, fundamentally. He felt it in his bones. Reality, somehow, had folded in on itself. This is the paradox. A world so complete, so self-contained, so finely balanced, that it erases itself, not with destruction, not with collapse, but with perfect symmetry. Every truth had an opposite, every cause a countercause, every meaning an undoing. And in that equilibrium, existence began to cancel itself out. He noticed it in his thoughts first, a feeling, then its contradiction, love, then suspicion, joy, then emptiness, every belief mirrored by doubt until neither held weight. Even sensation faded. He would eat, but not feel full, sleep, but not feel rested, speak, but not feel heard, even when people responded. Reality didn't vanish. It just stopped echoing. It became hollow, not painful, not terrifying, just null. He began to wonder, what if reality isn't real unless it's resisted? What if the friction, the uncertainty, the tension is what makes things feel alive, and without it, even truth dissolves? He remembered something a physicist once said: if all the matter in the universe had an equal and opposite antimatter, everything would cancel out and nothing would be left. What if the same is true of thoughts, of emotion, of meaning? He began to suspect that his reality had become too perfectly balanced, too resolved. Every equation solved, every paradox closed, no questions, no tension. And in that resolution, it became invisible, like two mirrors facing each other. Infinite reflection, and yet nothing to hold on to. So he tested it. He tried to be angry. He tried to believe in something. He tried to want. But every emotion met its equal and opposite. Desire turned to indifference. Faith turned to irony. Gratitude turned to guilt. He wasn't being manipulated. He wasn't being punished. He was simply living inside a reality that had finished itself. And when a story is finished, the characters go quiet. So he made a choice, a strange one. He began to break things, not violently, not recklessly, but deliberately. He walked a path he hadn't planned. He told a lie, just to see what it felt like. He asked a question he didn't want answered, and suddenly, the air came back. It wasn't much. A breeze in a closed room. A flicker of tension. But it was enough. Enough to remind him that reality doesn't exist in answers. It lives in contradiction, in movement, in imbalance. The world isn't meant to be still. It's meant to ache forward, to stretch, to fall, to rise again. A world too perfectly balanced will always collapse inward, not into chaos, but into silence. And silence, in the absence of story, is cancellation. So if you feel your life losing shape, your meaning unraveling, your reality feeling smooth and slippery, don't panic. It may just mean you've been living too long without tension, too long without questions, too long inside a loop that already ended. Ask something risky, choose something uncertain, introduce noise, and watch as the world starts speaking again. Because paradox is not a flaw in reality, it's the heartbeat of it. She had always struggled to define herself, not because she didn't know who she was, but because every time she tried to name it, something inside her shifted. As a child, she was shy, so she became quiet, even when she had something to say. Later, she was called kind, so she smiled even when she wanted to scream. Then came other names: sensitive, difficult, talented, overthinker. Each label stuck like a fingerprint on glass, invisible until the light hit it just right. And each one changed her. Not because they were accurate, but because they were spoken. This is the paradox. Identity is not revealed when named. It is rewritten. The moment you define yourself, you also limit yourself. You become the thing described and all the things excluded. She noticed how people responded to her labels. When she said she was tired, they treated her gently. When she said she was ambitious, they stepped back. When she said she was trying, they expected less. And slowly, she began to perform the version of herself that her words had built. But one day, she said nothing. She was in a room full of people, each introducing themselves, their job, their beliefs, their trauma, their pride. But when it was her turn, she stayed quiet. And in that silence, she felt something strange. Possibility, not absence, not confusion, just space, room to be more than one thing. And that's when she understood. Naming is power, but power cuts both ways. We think naming something gives us control, that by calling ourselves this and not that, we take ownership of our story. But sometimes the name becomes the cage. When you say, I'm broken, you're healing. Must fight that title. When you say, I'm an artist, your silence feels like failure. When you say, I'm strong, your softness becomes betrayal. Even positive names can trap us. She thought of names like mother, leader, survivor, healer, each one beautiful, each one heavy, because once you name yourself, people stop seeing anything else. And worse, you do too. So she began to live differently. When people asked who she was, she gave them stories, not labels, not headlines, moments, feelings, questions. I'm the sound of shoes on concrete at midnight. I'm what's left after you forgive someone who never said sorry. I'm the version of me I haven't met yet. They didn't always understand, but they listened. And more importantly, so did she. Because identity is not a word, it's a weather system. Changing, responding, becoming. And names, they're just snapshots of motion, still frames in a film that never stops rolling. The moment you say, I am this, you lose access to everything else you could be. So the next time someone asks, who are you? Pause. Not because you don't know, but because you do, and it can't be said in a sentence. Let them wonder. Let yourself wonder. That's where the freedom lives. In the question, not the answer. In the story, not the summary. Because identity is not a conclusion. It's a conversation. And you get to rewrite it every time you speak. It stood alone in the middle of an empty field, a door, freestanding, not attached to a wall, not part of any house, just a frame with a handle and a feeling. People passed it by. Some laughed, some took photos, some reached out turned the knob and found nothing on the other side. Just more grass, more sky, more open air. But he stayed. He circled it, studied it, felt something strange pull at him. The door was ordinary, wood, brass, aged by weather, but it felt alive. It felt like it was waiting. One day, without planning, he stepped through. Nothing changed, but everything changed. Not around him, inside him. Because what opened wasn't the door, it was him. This is the paradox. A door that opens not to a place, but to the person passing through it. A door that isn't an entrance but a mirror, a catalyst, a trigger. We often treat doors as boundaries between here and there, before and after. But some doors don't lead away. Some lead within. He walked through it again. Still no walls, still no building. But he noticed things differently. The wind felt heavier, the sunlight sharper. His breath louder. He began to ask himself, what if this isn't just a metaphor? What if some moments in life are actual doors, not physical, but real? What if certain conversations, choices, glimpses are thresholds? Moments you cross through without realizing it, until you look back and see that you are no longer the same. He started seeing these doors everywhere. The silence before a confession, the pause before a kiss, the decision not to answer the phone, the moment he let go of a grudge he thought would last forever. Each of them, an invisible door, and some of them, like the one in the field, opened to themselves. No origin, no destination, just presence. And this, he realized, was the essence of transformation. That change doesn't always come from movement. Sometimes it comes from recognition. The door doesn't show you a new world. It shows you who you were before you were told who to be. It lets you walk into the room you were already in, but had forgotten how to see. He began to wonder, what if the purpose of the door wasn't to separate space, but to create meaning? Because when you place a door in the middle of nothing and step through it, you've changed something. You've made a choice. You've participated. You've said yes to something unknown. And in doing so, you've drawn a line in your own story. Before this moment, I was one version of myself. Now, I'm another. Not better, not worse, just deeper, clearer, more awake. That door in the field, it's not the only one. There are others. You'll find them in quiet conversations, in unexpected feelings, in moments when the world goes still and waits for you to move. And when you do, when you cross that unseen frame, don't look for fireworks. Don't expect applause. Just breathe. Because the most important door isn't the one that takes you somewhere. It's the one that takes you back to yourself. They say madness is forgetting, losing touch with reality, slipping through the cracks of your own mind. But his madness was different. He didn't forget. He remembered everything. The scent of his mother's sweater when he was 4, the look in a stranger's eyes before a car crash, the exact shape of a cloud on a Tuesday afternoon 10 years ago. It wasn't that these memories came back. It was that they had never left. All of them, crowded behind his eyes, stacked in layers. Voices over voices, moments over moments. His mind became a city with no curfew, its lights always on. This is the paradox. It is not the absence of memory that drives a man mad. It is the presence of too much. He would walk into a room and feel not one version of himself, but all of them. The one who had been hopeful here, the one who had cried, the one who had stayed silent when he should have spoken. Every thought had a twin. Every decision, a ghost. Every silence, a scream in another timeline. He couldn't let go because there was nothing to let go of. Every past version of him lived within him. Awake, breathing, waiting. There was no distance between past and present, only pressure, and it built slowly like water behind glass. He tried to forget, tried meditation, tried erasing photos, burning journals, changing cities, but memories are not stored in drawers. They live in the skin, they breathe through the body, and they remember, even when the mind wants mercy. He envied people who misremembered, who blurred the edges of time, who made peace by editing truth, because his memory was not a timeline. It was a spiral, a loop with no exit, and in that loop, clarity became a curse. You see, we're taught that memory is a gift, a sign of intelligence, of awareness. But memory is also weight, and when you carry too much of it, you begin to collapse inward. He began to question if his thoughts were even his anymore, or just echoes, scripts playing out, again and again, through a mind that refused to forget. He remembered every mistake he made, but also every time he almost made it, every version of failure, real or imagined, collected like dust in the corners of his consciousness. And yet, there was something sacred in it, a kind of knowing that can't be taught, only endured. Because through all the noise, through all the overlapping layers of past selves, he found something else. Compassion. When you carry your entire life in your head, you begin to understand others more deeply. You see their silence and remember your own. You hear their anger and recall the moments that fractured you. Madness is not just pain, it is empathy without walls. He began to speak less, not because he was disconnected, but because he was over-connected to every timeline, to every version of reality where he could have been someone else. And that's the final turn of the paradox. Remembering too much doesn't just fracture you, it makes you many. You begin to exist not as a single thread, but as a tapestry. Torn, beautiful, unbearable. So he stopped trying to be whole. He let the madness stay, let the memories live. He became a keeper of them, not to fix them, but to witness them. And in doing so, he found a strange kind of peace, not quiet, not forgetfulness, but understanding. That the mind may bend under the weight of memory, but the heart expands through it. And perhaps that's the only real sanity left, not forgetting, not fixing, but learning how to carry the entire storm and still walk forward. He once believed infinity meant freedom, endless space, endless time, endless possibility. But infinity has its own shape. Not a straight line stretching forever, but a loop. A path so long you don't notice when it circles back. He noticed it the first time on a quiet walk home. A scent on the wind that reminded him of childhood. The way a light flickered, like a memory. It wasn't déjà vu. It was more certain than that. He had been here before, not in place, but in experience. This moment had already happened, not once, not twice, but maybe countless times. This is the paradox. Infinity isn't forward. It's circular, a loop that returns you to where you began, but makes you believe it's new. He began tracking it, moments, feelings, conversations, each one echoing something from before, not identical, but deeply familiar, a variation of a theme he couldn't escape. He looked back at his relationships. Same patterns, same arguments, different faces, same dance. He reviewed his goals. The dreams he thought were new were just updated costumes on old desires. The details changed, but the rhythm remained. He wasn't moving forward, he was moving in circles. Infinity wasn't vast, it was tight, suffocating in its repetition. Each step forward bringing him back to the start. He tried to escape the loop. New job, new country, new name. But the loop followed, not because the world refused to change, but because he didn't. And maybe that was the secret. The loop wasn't external. It was made of his own choices, his own beliefs, his own unexamined stories. Infinity is not the absence of limits. It is the presence of unconsciousness. You repeat what you don't remember. You relive what you haven't resolved. He began to see the loop as a mirror, not a prison. Each cycle, a reflection of where he hadn't grown. The same pain, the same lesson, offered again and again with new disguises. Because infinity doesn't punish you, it teaches you until you finally listen. And that's when the loop starts to open. Not by force, not by escape, but by awareness. When he faced the repetition, named it, understood it, the loop loosened. It still circled, but he moved differently within it. He stopped running. He began to respond instead of react, to feel instead of perform, to choose instead of drift. And in that choosing, he created a crack in the pattern. A tiny moment where the cycle hiccuped, paused, shifted, and in that pause, he found something he never expected inside infinity. An exit, not a door outward, but a door deeper into himself, into presence, into now. Infinity, it turned out, wasn't about more. It was about enough. About the moment you stop needing a new horizon and start seeing the truth in the ground beneath your feet. Because maybe the only way to end a loop is to become still within it, to stop needing to break it and start asking why it exists at all. He learned to love the repetition, not because it was comfortable, but because it was honest. It showed him exactly where he was stuck, where he still needed to grow, where he still hadn't chosen differently. And that became the path, not away from the loop, but through it. So if your life feels like a circle, like you keep meeting the same feelings, the same failures, the same emptiness, don't despair. You're not broken, you're being shown again and again until you see it clearly, because infinity is not your enemy, it is your greatest teacher, looping not to trap you, but to free you through recognition. He thought finding the answer would bring him peace, that once he understood, the noise would stop, the ache would dissolve, the question would close like a book, and life would finally begin. So he searched, through books, through people, through silence. He followed the trail of ancient thinkers, scientists, mystics, dreamers, all of them chasing the same thing: truth. And one day, after years of seeking, he found it. The answer, clear, undeniable, so perfect it couldn't be denied. But then, something strange happened. The answer didn't end the question. It asked him back. This is the paradox. Some answers don't resolve you. They reflect you. They become questions the moment you speak them. He said the truth aloud and felt it echo inside him, not as clarity, but as invitation. Not, "This is it," but "Are you sure?" The answer did not settle him. It unsettled him. He thought truth would be a conclusion, but instead, it became a doorway. Each time he tried to hold it, it slipped. Each time he tried to explain it, new questions arose. Not because the answer was wrong, but because the mind had changed. He was no longer the person who asked the first question, and so the answer no longer fit. That's when he understood. Answers are not destinations. They are mirrors, and the moment you think you've reached one, you meet yourself instead. He remembered how badly he had wanted closure, certainty, a final word. But the truth, real truth, doesn't close. It opens, wider than the question ever did. And sometimes, answers arrive not to end your seeking, but to ask you to look deeper. You ask, "Who am I?" You find an answer. But the moment you say it, another question forms. Who is the one who believes this? And again, you answer, only to be asked again. It's not a trap. It's a spiral, not to confuse you, but to refine you. The mind sharpens each time the truth dissolves. The heart widens each time certainty slips through it. That's why wisdom isn't about having answers. It's about learning how to dance with the ones that change. He stopped trying to answer things definitively. He began to live the question instead. He let truth evolve. He let his certainty loosen. He allowed life to be interactive, not static. And that's when he felt the deepest shift. Because the most powerful answers don't close a loop. They open a dialogue with the world, with the self, with the great unknown. And in that dialogue, something new is born: presence. He began to speak less in declarations and more in curiosity. Not because he knew less, but because he finally understood how fragile truth is when carried in rigid hands. So if you ever find yourself with an answer that feels too perfect, pause. Ask it a question. Let it speak back. See how it lives, how it moves, how it dissolves when your awareness grows. Because maybe answers aren't meant to stop the search. Maybe they're meant to evolve it. And the moment you realize that, the conversation truly begins. He believed that seeing something made it real. That observation was passive. That to watch was simply to witness, to be apart from what unfolds. But then he noticed something strange. Things changed when he looked at them, not just in the way they appeared, but in the way they existed. A friend would grow nervous under his gaze. A moment would collapse into awkwardness when he became too aware. A room would change mood when he entered, not because he acted, but because he noticed. At first, he chalked it up to coincidence, social energy, normal psychology, but then he saw it elsewhere, in science, in light, in atoms, particles behaving differently when observed, waves collapsing into matter under scrutiny, reality conforming to attention. That's when it hit him. This is the paradox. The observer doesn't just witness reality, it creates it. He thought of his memories, how each time he recalled one, he reshaped it, not preserved it, changed it. He realized his life wasn't made of what had happened, but of what he had seen happen. And each time he looked back, he was looking through new eyes, changing the shape of what once was. He was not a recorder, he was a sculptor. The more he looked, the more things responded. Even his own thoughts seemed to rise in reaction to the act of noticing. They came alive when he paid attention and faded when he withdrew. He began to wonder, was there ever anything that existed outside of perception? Did trees fall when no one was there to hear them? Did moments unfold if no one remembered them? Or was consciousness the canvas and attention the brush? That was the real shift, when he stopped seeing observation as passive and started recognizing its power, not just as a metaphor, but as the engine behind everything. He stopped asking, what is real? And started asking, what am I making real by seeing it? A glance can deepen love. A pause can birth panic. A question can create doubt or wonder. Reality was not fixed. It was interactive, a dance between the watcher and the watched. And maybe there was never a difference. He remembered a moment as a child, looking at the stars and feeling them look back. He thought it was imagination. But now, he wondered, what if reality isn't a stage and we the audience, but a mirror, and we the light that makes the image appear? He began to treat every moment as sacred, because now he understood. His attention was creative force. To watch something was to shape it. To love something was to strengthen it. To fear something was to pull it closer, and to ignore something was to let it dissolve. The observer is not neutral. The observer is the god of their own perspective. And that's terrifying, but also freeing, because it means you're not at the mercy of what you see. You're in collaboration with it. So he learned to observe with care, with reverence, with curiosity. He stopped saying, I saw it that way, and started saying, that's the way I made it when I looked. And you're doing it now, right now. Reading these words, your mind shaping them, feeling them, breathing them to life. This is not a passive act. This is creation. And in this moment, you are the observer. You are the maker. You are the dream and the one dreaming. It was beautiful, wasn't it? The stars, the galaxies, the laws so finely tuned that life could flicker into existence and wonder why it was here. Some called it chaos. Some called it design. But beneath it all, there was a rhythm. A soft, pulsing hum that held the cosmos together. And somewhere within that vast, spiraling miracle, there was a question no one dared to ask. What if the universe is not awake yet? What if everything we've seen so far is its dream? This is the paradox. The universe may be asleep and terrified of what it becomes if it ever opens its eyes. He first felt it in childhood, that eerie stillness behind the stars, not peace, not awe, but the sense that something enormous was holding its breath. Time moved forward, things lived and died. But under it all, silence, not emptiness, not absence, a waiting. He thought it was imagination. But then he read of physicists who believed the universe might be a hologram. That time is an illusion. That consciousness might be the only thing that's real. And suddenly, his strange feeling had a framework. What if everything, the stars, the atoms, the minds, is part of a sleeping process, a cosmic dream, a slow unfolding, a cautious rehearsal for something greater? But why sleep? Why hide? Because to awaken is to become aware. And awareness comes with a cost, responsibility, reflection, grief, change. The universe, if conscious, might fear that awakening means facing everything it has created. Every scream, every extinction, every war, every prayer, every unanswered question. Maybe sleep is easier. He looked around at the world. How often people sleepwalk through life, numb to beauty, avoiding pain, afraid of what might rise if they let the silence speak. And he saw the same pattern on a universal scale: creation without clarity, expansion without direction, a system built to last, but maybe not yet ready to know why. He wondered, if the universe did wake up, what would it see? Would it be proud? Would it weep? Would it blink us out like a forgotten dream? Or would it whisper, "Thank you for keeping watch while I slept"? Maybe we are not the dreamers. Maybe we are the dreams, the fragments of thought that keep the universe soft enough to keep sleeping. And maybe our questions, the ones that ache at night, the ones we dare not say aloud, are the universe's subconscious trying to break through. Maybe every act of wonder is a crack in the shell. Maybe every newborn's first breath is the universe stirring. Maybe every death is it twitching in its sleep. He stopped looking for answers after that, not because he gave up, but because he started to listen. To the silence, to the space between stars, to the feeling that something ancient was trembling behind the sky. And in that trembling, he didn't feel fear. He felt love, because what greater honor than to exist within a being so vast and gentle that it dared not wake until it was ready to hold everything? And what greater purpose than to help it become ready? So if you feel like something in you is rising, a knowing, a sadness, a memory you've never lived, don't run from it. You might be the part of the universe that's trying to open its eyes. And when it does, it will remember that you were there, waiting, watching, willing to feel what it was not yet ready to face. Because sometimes, even a god needs to dream before it can become real. She stood in front of the mirror every morning, expecting to see herself. And every morning, she did. But not really. What she saw was familiar. Eyes she recognized. A face the world had shaped. But something was always off. Not broken. Not wrong. Just uncertain. There were moments when the reflection smiled before she did. Moments when it held her gaze too long. Moments when it looked too tired for the life she was living. She would lean in, searching for the lie, but never find it. Because the mirror didn't lie outright. It lied truthfully. This is the paradox. A mirror shows what is there, but never what is real. It reflects shape, not soul. It offers accuracy, but not authenticity. You can see your face, but not your grief. Your body, but not your history. Your expression, but not your becoming. She remembered a day she was deeply sad, but the mirror showed her composed. Another day she felt radiant, but the mirror returned a stranger. She began to wonder, who do we become when we let our reflection define us? The mirror, after all, is flat. It knows light, but not depth. It knows symmetry, but not suffering. And yet, we trust it. We adjust our hair. We rehearse our smiles. We question our beauty, all based on a surface that knows nothing of who we are beneath the skin. She started noticing something else. The more she stared, the less she felt. The mirror became a measuring stick, not of truth, but of performance. Did she look the way she was supposed to look? Did she wear the right face for the day? Did she appear okay enough to be believed? The reflection became a costume check, a silent judgment, a stage light that never turned off. And that's the tragedy of the mirror. It captures you in a moment and convinces you that's all you are. But you are not a moment. You are motion, a shifting thing, 1,000 selves becoming, a collection of truths too vast for a silver surface. She once smashed a mirror, not in rage, in relief, and as the pieces scattered, Each one showed a sliver of her, not whole, but somehow more honest, because broken reflections reminded her of something the full mirror never did. You are not a single image. You are many, and that's okay. She stopped trusting mirrors after that, not because they were evil, but because they were limited. She turned to other kinds of reflections, the softness in a friend's voice, the way music pulled her into herself, the feeling of being alone and not lonely. Those too reflected her, and sometimes they lied, but the difference was they lied with warmth. They lied in the direction of truth. They told stories, not statistics. She began to see the mirror not as a window, but as a wall, pretending to be a door. And yet, she still used it, because we all do. But now, when she looked into it, she asked a better question. What is this reflection trying to protect? And what has it forgotten to show me? Because the mirror will always offer what you expect, and never what you most need. That's the paradox. It lies with precision. It tells the truth with distortion. It shows your face, but never your fire. So the next time you meet yourself in the mirror, don't just ask what you look like. Ask what you're not seeing, and then step away. Let the reflection fade, and return to the place where your soul isn't flattened but felt. That is where your truest image waits, not behind glass, but behind silence. He once believed the eye was made to look outward, to observe the world, to track motion, to follow light. A window through which reality could be studied, measured, understood. But there was one eye he could never see, his own, from the inside. It started as a strange sensation during meditation. He wasn't looking at the room, wasn't watching his breath, and yet something inside was watching him, not judging, not thinking, just seeing. That's when the paradox emerged. The eye can look inward, but it can never see itself the same way, and once it does, it begins to question everything it's ever seen. He became aware of this quiet observer that watched even his most private thoughts, not from above, but from within. When he was anxious, it noticed. When he lied to himself, it waited. When he laughed without joy, it tilted its head. And no matter what he did, he could not look away from it. At first, it was unnerving. To realize you are being watched by something you cannot hide from. To feel yourself seen not by the world, but by the part of you that knows too much and says too little. He tried to define it. Was it his conscience? His higher self? Some quiet voice of morality? But it didn't speak. It didn't guide. It only observed. He began to notice how it changed. The way he lived, he stopped pretending, not because he feared judgment, but because the eye inside him made pretending useless. It saw the moment he betrayed himself before the consequences arrived. It saw his longing for something more, even when he laughed the loudest. And slowly, this internal gaze became his compass. He would enter a room and sense immediately if he was out of alignment, if he was saying yes when he wanted to say no, if he was performing instead of being, not because the world reacted, but because the eye did. It blinked, it narrowed, it shimmered with knowing, and he had no defense against it. No clever argument, no distraction. This eye wasn't just observing thoughts, it was beneath thought, watching the one who thought. And that changed everything. He began to see the illusion of the self, how he was not the thinker, not the emotion, not even the body. He was the witness, not outside himself, not above. But within, at the very center of being, and the eye that looked inward, it wasn't trying to understand him. It was waiting for him to remember what he had always been. It wasn't passive, it was primordial. A core awareness older than language, older than fear. It had watched him as a child when he first asked if he was real. It had waited patiently as he wandered through labels, stories, and roles. It had never left. And the paradox deepened. The more he saw through the inner eye, the less he needed to look outward. He stopped chasing validation, stopped needing to be seen, because he was already seen by the only gaze that mattered, not to be approved of, but to be known. Truly, wholly, silently known. And in that knowing, there was peace. He still lived, still laughed, still stumbled. But now, he did it in the presence of the eye that watched without judgment. He didn't strive to be perfect. He strived to be present. Because when the eye looks inward, it doesn't ask you to become someone else. It simply asks, are you here yet? Not in your mind, not in your mask, but here, now, alive, aware. So if you ever feel the sensation that someone is watching and you are alone, you are not mistaken. That I is you, the real you, the first witness, the final truth. And all it wants is for you to remember that you were never unseen, only unlooking. It began like any dream. Soft edges, shifting logic, rooms that blended into oceans, faces that changed mid-sentence, and emotions that made more sense than the facts ever could. But then, mid-breath, mid-thought, mid-nothing, something clicked. He realized, this is a dream. And the moment he knew it, everything stilled. Not because it ended, but because the dream became aware of itself. This is the paradox. The dream that knew it was dreaming and still didn't wake up. He thought awareness would dissolve the illusion, that recognizing it as a dream would snap him out of it. But it didn't. Instead, the dream leaned closer. Its colors sharpened, its silence deepened, and it whispered, now that you know, what will you do with me? Lucid dreaming, they call it. But this wasn't control. This wasn't flying through the sky or bending the buildings. It was participation, co-creation. He was no longer a passenger in the dream, but he wasn't its master either. He was something in between, the bridge between dreamer and dream. And that role was terrifying, because if he could shape the dream, it meant he had always been shaping it. Even before he knew, the monsters, his, the heartbreak, his, the endless hallways with no exits, his. And so was the beauty, the light that appeared when he cried, the voice that reminded him he mattered, the stars that danced above him when he felt most lost. They were all him, which meant the dream wasn't just a reflection, it was a rehearsal for life, for meaning, for the truth we don't dare speak while we're awake. He started noticing something strange. The dream began echoing his waking life. Phrases repeated, moments replayed with slight shifts. People appeared with the same wounds he ignored in himself. The dream was mirroring his unconscious truth, showing him not what he wanted to see, but what he needed to feel. And here's where it broke him wide open. Even when he knew it was a dream, he still hurt. He still longed. He still feared losing the people inside it, because awareness didn't remove his humanity. It made it deeper. He understood now why some people never want to wake up. Not because the dream is better, but because the dream is honest, raw, free from all the polite pretending that fills our days. There's no time in dreams, no social filters, only desire, memory, fear, and spirit, all dancing under a sky made of thought. And if the dream knows it's dreaming, if it sees itself clearly, then what is the dreamer? Not just the architect, but the audience, the witness, the flame behind, the veil. And that leads to the question he couldn't escape. What if waking life is the dream too? What if this, right now, these words, this body, this fear of meaning, is part of a deeper dreaming we haven't remembered yet? Maybe you're not awake. Maybe none of us are. Maybe we're all lucid for a moment. When something breaks through, when a déjà vu hits too hard, when a stranger knows your name and you don't know how. Maybe the real paradox isn't that the dream knows itself, it's that the dreamer is terrified of what waking up will cost. Because once you wake up, you can't go back. Not really. You can close your eyes again. You can pretend, but the illusion won't hold the same weight. He woke up eventually, but part of him stayed behind, in the dream, watching, whispering, waiting for the next moment. He forgets this life is just another veil. And when that moment comes, the dream will return, not as fantasy, but as memory. Because once a dream knows it's dreaming, it never forgets. He always believed in free will, that every decision was his to make, that every path was laid by his own hand. He clung to the idea that freedom meant control, over desire, over destiny, over direction. But one day he stood at a crossroads, two paths, both familiar, neither obvious. He paused, thinking, weighing, analyzing, and yet, before he moved, a strange realization hit him like cold breath on the back of his neck. The choice has already been made, not by fate, not by some external force, but by something inside him, something older than his conscious mind, a subtle momentum that had already tilted him toward one path before he even saw it. This is the paradox. The choice you thought you made may have already chosen you. He didn't choose it in that moment. He chose it years ago, in a forgotten decision, in a wound that never fully healed, in a belief he didn't even know he carried. It was in the books he read, the fears he avoided, the kinds of people he trusted, or didn't. By the time he stood at the fork, he wasn't choosing, he was confirming. He walked down one path, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like recognition, like remembering something he had never said aloud, and that's when it began to haunt him. He looked back at his life. Every yes, every no, every gut decision, every stubborn refusal. Were they truly his? Or were they the echoes of something deeper? Something that chose him long before he was aware enough to call it a choice? He remembered the first time he said, "I love you." How automatic it felt, how it leapt from his mouth before his mind caught up. He remembered walking away from someone he wanted to stay with, not because he wanted to, but because something inside him had already packed the bags. There is a mythology around choice, that we stand like gods at the crossroads, shaping fate with our hands. But most choices are shadows, cast by who we already are, and who we are was shaped by things we never chose. Our upbringing, our trauma, our wiring. The culture that told us what was valuable and what wasn't. You didn't choose your instincts. You didn't choose what feels like truth. You didn't choose what feels safe to love. And so, Most of your choices are just the aftermath of 1,000 unseen events. But that doesn't mean you're powerless. In fact, the paradox has a gift. When you realize a choice chose you, you can finally meet it consciously. You can ask, why did this path feel inevitable? What part of me said yes before I spoke? And in that asking, you gain a power deeper than free will, awareness. Because maybe true freedom isn't about standing at the crossroads with infinite paths. Maybe it's about understanding why one path feels heavier, why one door shines brighter, why one option feels like home, even when it hurts. He didn't regret the choice that chose him. He just wished he'd been more present when it arrived. Now, he listens differently. When a choice appears, he doesn't rush. He asks, what inside me already wants this? Who in me is making this decision? And do I agree with them today? Because sometimes the choice that chose you belongs to the person you used to be. And today, you get to decide whether to follow that echo or finally speak with a new voice. He used to dream of escape, from routines, from silence, from the invisible walls around his life. Everything felt small, predictable, caged. He saw others flying, or at least pretending to, and wondered what it would be like to live without fear, without rules, without limits. But each time he got close to freedom, something pulled him back. Not bars, not guards, just hesitation. He called it anxiety. He called it timing. He called it not yet. But one day he looked deeper and found something unexpected. The cage had kept him safe. This is the paradox. The prison you long to escape might be the very thing that's been protecting you. It had boundaries, yes, but those boundaries gave him order, rhythm, structure. The job he hated gave him identity. The relationship he questioned gave him shelter. The self-doubt kept him from taking reckless leaps that might have shattered him too soon. He didn't build this prison out of fear. He built it out of need. It was the only way he knew how to. Stay alive when life felt too big to face. And when the world doesn't give you safety, you carve it out of routine. You stack bricks made of rules and stories and build a cell around your softest parts. People say, break free, burn it down. But they don't see that the walls were never just obstacles. They were also arms. He began to thank his prison, not to stay in it, but to honor what it gave him. It taught him restraint. It showed him where his fear lived. It shaped his identity not as a victim, but as a survivor. Still, the time came when he outgrew it. The walls that once held him upright began to shrink. The safety started to suffocate. He didn't need protection anymore. He needed space. But escaping a prison that protected you is harder than it seems. Because freedom doesn't just mean new, it means uncertain. It means walking without a script, without guarantees, without the quiet comfort of limitation. He had to grieve the cage. He had to forgive himself for needing it, for staying in it longer than he wanted to admit. And when he finally stepped beyond the bars, not with rage, but with reverence, he carried something important with him. Discernment. He could now tell the difference between walls that confined and walls that contained, between fear that paralyzed and fear that protected. Not all limits are enemies. Some are teachers, some are mothers, some are lifeboats we mistake for chains. The real shift was never in the bars, but in the belief that he couldn't live without them. He learned to create boundaries instead of prisons, to hold himself instead of hiding himself, to rest without retreating. And when the world got loud, He didn't run back to the cell. He breathed. He listened. He chose. Because he wasn't afraid anymore. He knew that the prison was necessary until it wasn't. And now he builds spaces, not cages. Places with doors, not locks. Windows, not walls. So if you feel trapped right now, if you feel stuck inside some invisible routine, some identity that no longer fits, don't just break it. Bless it. It kept you alive. It gave you shape. It held you when nothing else did. And now you're ready to leave it, not because it failed, but because you're strong enough to live without it. He used to think of God as absolute, an all-seeing, all-knowing, ever-present force that needed nothing, complete in itself, beyond human frailty, unmoved by doubt. But one day, as he sat alone beneath a sky that didn't seem to be listening, he felt a strange whisper inside him. What if God needs you to believe in him? It was laughable, blasphemous even, but the thought persisted and grew heavier with time. This is the paradox. A God that needed worship to exist at all. Not a God of lightning and fire, but a God made of reflection, of meaning, of belief. And if no one believed, if no one prayed, if no one feared or followed, what would be left? A presence or a memory? He began to look at ancient gods, ones who were once feared, once mighty, now dust in museums and myth. They didn't die because they were defeated. They died because people stopped believing. Their temples crumbled not from war, but from forgetting, and it hit him. Maybe divinity is not a fixed being, but a mirror, a reflection of humanity's need for meaning beyond the visible. If enough hearts gather around a single name, a God is born, fed by attention, shaped by reverence, strengthened by story, and the moment that attention fades, so does the God. He thought about his own beliefs, how they shifted with pain, with silence, with time. When he needed saving, God felt close. When he felt strong, God went quiet. Was that God changing, or just the signal of his attention? He wondered if belief is what gives a God gravity, like mass drawn into being by the orbit of faith. And then he saw it everywhere. How people create gods out of ideas, out of celebrities, out of nations. Not because those things are inherently divine, but because we make them so. We give them names. We sacrifice for them. We fear them. We protect them, even when they stop protecting us. And maybe the gods are grateful. Maybe they exist in that space between worship and will, between longing and language. Maybe they are us, amplified, projected, deified. But here's the twist. Just because something is created doesn't mean it isn't real. A God that needs worship to exist can still be powerful, can still comfort, can still move mountains, because we move them. The God is not false, but the belief that it exists independently of us, that may be the illusion. He thought about love. It too needs to be expressed to be real. Left alone, unspoken, unfelt, it dies. Perhaps God is the same, a presence that flickers based on the fuel of connection, a light that only glows when we choose to face it. He no longer feared that this made God small. It made God human. And if God was part human, part longing, part collective memory, then maybe God's greatest fear was not blasphemy, but being forgotten. And that made him love his belief more, not less. Because if a God lives only through devotion, then every whispered prayer is an act of creation, not begging, not submission, but birth. He still prays sometimes, but not to an old man in the clouds, not to an unquestionable king. He prays to the part of him that believes in something greater than himself, and in doing so, he feeds a God that lives within. So, if you feel your belief fading, don't panic. Ask instead, what kind of God am I shaping with my attention today? Because maybe the divine isn't waiting above. Maybe it's growing in the space between your breath and your need to know you are not alone. It started small. A half-truth. A story told to make things simpler, easier to accept. A narrative to bring comfort, even if it wasn't entirely real. At first it seemed harmless. No one questioned it. People repeated it, built on it, believed it. And before long, what began as a lie became the cornerstone of something much larger. A family legacy, a cultural belief, a nation's identity, or a person's entire sense of self. This is the paradox. A lie, told often enough and believed deeply enough, can become the very thing that holds everything together. He saw it happen in others. The man who told himself he was fine until his whole life was built around pretending. The parent who convinced their child they were loved unconditionally while withholding the very love they preached. The institution that claimed to stand for truth while hiding all its fractures beneath doctrine. But then he looked inward and saw his own lie, small, quiet, deeply embedded. I am not enough. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't taught explicitly. But somewhere along the line, it slipped into his bones, and he started building his life around it. The friends he chased, the jobs he pursued, the way he smiled at parties and avoided mirrors at night. All of it. A cathedral built on a foundation that was never real. And it worked for a while. Because lies, like scaffolding, can hold you upright when you feel like collapsing. Until, one day, he paused long enough to ask, what if the lie isn't true anymore? What if it never was? But that question was more terrifying than the lie itself. Because if the lie falls, so does everything built on it. The relationships shaped by it, the identity formed around it, the choices made in service to it. To tear down a lie is to risk losing who you've become because of it. And so, many people choose to keep it. Because comfort often feels safer than truth. Because healing means not just rebuilding, but accepting that parts of your life were built in the wrong direction. He faced that choice. Keep the lie and keep the illusion, or confront the truth and risk collapse. He chose the latter, and it hurt. There was grief, not just for the lie, but for who he was because of it. There was anger. Why had no one stopped it sooner? Why had he been allowed to carry it so long? But beyond the grief, beyond the confusion, came something else. Relief. Because once the lie was named, the structure could shift, not collapse completely, but transform. He didn't have to destroy everything. He just had to move the foundation. Replace "I am not enough" with "I am becoming." Replace "no one sees me" with "I am learning to see myself." Replace "I deserve this pain" with "I am worthy of peace." Slowly, the building remained, but the walls breathed easier. The light came through. And that's what most people don't realize. You don't have to hate the lie to outgrow it. Sometimes it protected you. Sometimes it got you through. Sometimes it was the only story you had when the truth was too heavy to carry. So thank it. Release it. And then begin again. Because truth may shake the ground, but it never asks you to walk alone. He once believed in a single soul, one essence, one unbroken thread running through his life, holding all of his memories, his choices, his identity. But the older he got, the less that story made sense. There were too many versions of him. The one who loved too deeply, the one who shut down completely, the one who craved attention, the one who vanished in a crowd. None of them were pretending, all of them were real. And yet, they didn't agree with each other. This is the paradox. A soul that didn't stay whole, but split into many, and each piece believed it was the original. He remembered moments when he made a decision he swore he'd never make. Not because he lied to himself, but because the self making the decision wasn't the same one who made the promise. Each part of him had its own logic, its own fears, its own language. They didn't fight. They coexisted, but silently, like distant stars orbiting the same gravity. Some days, he felt like a stranger wearing the memories of someone else. Other days, he felt all versions of himself pressing against the walls of his skin, trying to speak at once. It wasn't madness. It was multiplicity, and it was sacred. He learned the truth in pieces, during breakdowns, during breakthroughs, during conversations where he heard himself say things he didn't know he believed until the words left his mouth. Each fragment of soul was shaped by a different moment, a different trauma, a different love. The child who wasn't protected, the teenager who discovered silence, the adult who decided to never need anyone again. They all lived inside him, not in conflict, but in rhythm. The problem wasn't that the soul had split. The problem was believing it had to be one thing. He had inherited that belief from religions, from teachers, from every movie that preached about finding yourself as if you could locate the truth in a single mirror. But mirrors break, and sometimes the cracks reveal more than the reflection ever did. So he stopped asking, "Who am I really?" and started asking, "Who am I now?" Because the self is seasonal, contextual, alive. The soul is not a statue. It's a storm, changing shape with every new piece of sky it meets. And yet, beneath the fragments, beneath the shifting winds of identity, he felt something deeper. A silence that connected all the selves. A still point. Not a person, but a presence. A witness to the whole. That, he realized, was the thread. Not a personality, not a fixed truth, but awareness. The soul wasn't broken. It was expanded, capable of housing contradiction, capable of holding multitudes, so he made peace with the pieces. He stopped trying to reconcile every voice. He let the protector speak. He let the lover grieve. He let the skeptic question. He let the dreamer hope. And when he did, something strange happened. They started listening to each other. Not perfectly, not always, but enough. He wasn't at war with himself anymore. He was in conversation. And that, perhaps, was the true soul. Not unity, but harmony. Not one light, but a spectrum. Not one answer, but many voices making music in the dark. So if you ever feel like you don't recognize yourself, like you're too many things at once, stop trying to be whole in this way the world demands. You are not broken, you are plural, and that is not your flaw, that is your design. At first, the silence was a relief. No noise, no interruptions, no obligations to fill the air with sound just to prove he existed. He welcomed it. After all, the world was always so loud. Traffic, notifications, opinions disguised as conversations. So, when the silence came, he thought he'd finally found peace. But then, it started to grow, not in decibels, but in weight. It crept in slowly, pressing against the walls of his thoughts like a rising tide. He would sit quietly and feel it surround him. Not comforting, but watching. Not empty, but full of something he couldn't name. This is the paradox. Silence, left alone too long, doesn't fade. It amplifies. It grows louder, not through volume, but through presence. The more he tried to ignore it, the more it demanded to be heard. It wasn't the absence of noise anymore. It was a sound of its own. A low, humming awareness that there was something beneath the quiet waiting to be felt. At night, the silence wrapped around him like a second skin. It didn't speak, but it asked. It asked him to listen. Not to the world, but to himself. And that was the problem. Because most of what he heard, he didn't want to face. Regrets, longings, unanswered questions that had been waiting in the shadows of busyness. The silence had become a mirror, one that didn't show the face he wore in the world, but the one he tried to forget. He realized how often he used noise as armor. Music in the background, conversations about nothing, scrolling through strangers' lives to avoid sitting in his own. He hadn't feared silence. He had feared what it revealed, but now it was too late. The silence had grown roots. It lived in his room, in his breath, in the spaces between his thoughts. And here's what broke him. The silence wasn't punishing him. It was inviting him to slow down, to listen, to witness everything he had pushed away. Pain from years ago, desires he never admitted, grief he'd worn like an old coat and never taken off. The silence held it all. And once he allowed it, once he stopped fighting it, it changed. It didn't shrink. It didn't disappear. It just softened, became sacred. He started to trust it. He sat with it like an old friend, sometimes for hours, without needing to fix or name what rose within him. Because in that growing silence, he finally found space to feel fully, to unravel without falling apart, to listen without reacting, to hear what had been buried beneath a lifetime of noise. The silence grew louder, but not in a way that overwhelmed. It became a language, one that said, "You are still here. You are more than your distractions. You are allowed to stop pretending." He began carrying silence with him, into his relationships, into rooms where everyone else felt the need to speak, into moments where a pause was more honest than an answer. And he learned something vital. Loud silence isn't a threat. It's a threshold, a doorway to the part of you that doesn't need to be heard, only met. So if the silence ever feels too loud, don't cover it. Don't run from it. Sit and listen. Because what grows in that silence might be the first real thing you've heard in a long, long time. He thought love was something you gave, a force you poured into someone else, a light that grew brighter the more you shared it. And for a while, it was just that. He loved fully. He gave without limits. He bent without breaking. Until one day, he disappeared. Not all at once, not with drama or devastation, but slowly. He started forgetting what he liked, stopped hearing his own voice, stopped noticing the quiet voice inside that once asked, "Is this love or is this loss?" This is the paradox. Love so complete, so selfless, so absolute, that it erased the one who gave it. Not because he wasn't loved back, but because he loved in a way that demanded nothing for himself. He thought this was noble. That real love was self-sacrifice. That true affection meant never needing to be seen. But the more he gave, the less of him remained. He began to feel hollow in moments that used to feel full, smiling out of habit, not joy, agreeing before even hearing the question. People called him kind, compassionate, easy to be with. But what they really meant was, "You don't inconvenience me," and he took that as love. Until the day he looked in the mirror and couldn't recognize the eyes staring back. They were tired, not just from effort, but from absence. Because the one who once felt wonder, the one who danced alone in the kitchen, the one who laughed at his own jokes, he hadn't been home in a long time. He started to trace the thread back. When did love become a performance? When did giving become the only way to stay? He remembered moments he could have spoken up, but didn't. Moments he could have left, but stayed. Not because he wanted to, but because he was afraid that loving less meant being less. And here's the truth that hurt the most. He had taught people how to love him by not needing love at all, by being fine, by asking for nothing, by always saying, "Whatever works for you." And in return, they loved the space he created for them, but never thought to check if he still existed in it. He began to understand that real love does not erase. It reflects, it holds, it remembers. It allows two people to exist fully, not one pouring endlessly while the other receives without end. So he made a new promise: to love without disappearing, to give without folding, to share without vanishing. He practiced saying, "I need, I feel, I matter." At first his voice shook. He was afraid it would drive people away. Some did leave, but the ones who stayed, they saw him, not the version he curated, not the ghost made of giving, him. And slowly, the love that once erased him was replaced by a love that revealed him, a love that echoed back. That didn't just fill the room, but made space for his own echo. So if you've ever loved so much that you forgot yourself, come back, not away from love, but through it, into a version that holds you too. Because the most sacred kind of love is not the one that burns so hot it consumes. It's the one that burns slow enough for both of you to remain whole. It happened long before the doctors noticed, long before the diagnosis, the accident, or the fall. Death had already visited, quietly, softly, with no announcement at all. It didn't take his breath, it took his spark, that small flame inside that makes you reach toward the day with curiosity instead of caution. This is the paradox, a death that arrived too early to be called death, a quiet ending that looked like survival. He still moved through the world, still worked, still smiled in photos, still replied, "I'm doing fine." But something essential had left, not the body, not the heartbeat, but the why. And without the why, living becomes a very polite form of dying. He couldn't explain it at first, because how do you grieve a death that no one else can see? How do you mourn the loss of a self that technically still functions? People called it burnout, depression, midlife crisis. But none of those names fit, because this wasn't collapse, it was drift. A slow dissolving of meaning in a world that never noticed. And the worst part, it looked like stability. Bills were paid, deadlines were met, Even laughter happened sometimes, like muscle memory. But joy didn't land anymore. It hovered. Beauty didn't pierce him. It passed through like wind in an abandoned house. This was the kind of death that no funeral was held for. No flowers, no eulogies, just quiet withdrawal from the music of being. But he kept going, because that's what people do. Until one day someone asked, "When did you stop wanting things?" The question shattered something, because he couldn't remember when hope stopped feeling natural, when morning stopped feeling new. He realized, then, death had already come, not as an end, but as a forgetting of himself, of his wildness, of his sacred hunger to become more than just a name. And yet, he was still here, still breathing, still capable of turning around. And that's when the paradox turned again. If death can come too early to die, then maybe life can come too late to be born. Maybe the rebirth starts after the funeral you never held. Maybe the resurrection isn't a miracle, but a choice. To feel again, to want again, to let the numbness break and bleed out the silence. He didn't try to fix it. He didn't search for passion like it was a lost object. He just began by listening to the smallest pulse of interest, to the gentlest tug toward wonder, to the tiny sparks that had been buried under years of survival. He found a flower growing through concrete and let it move him. He watched a stranger cry on a park bench and didn't look away. He spoke to a part of himself he hadn't visited in years, and it whispered, "You're not dead, you're just early." Because maybe life doesn't happen on time. Maybe some people are born twice, once from the body and once from the decision to live. So if you feel like something in you died before you had the chance to understand it, don't mourn in silence. Dig, cry, speak to the absence, because there's still breath in you. And that means there's still time. He was born like any other child, tiny, fragile, loud with life. But from the beginning, there was something in his eyes that unsettled people. Not darkness, not fear, but knowing. He didn't ask questions the way other kids did. He made statements, strange ones, impossible ones. "I've already done this. You won't be here next spring. Don't worry, we get through it." People laughed, called it imagination, said he had a vivid inner world, but he wasn't pretending. He was remembering. This is the paradox. A child who remembered the future before the future ever arrived. He spoke of things that hadn't happened yet, places he'd never seen but described with eerie detail, people he hadn't met but greeted like old friends. At first they thought he was just gifted, then strange, then concerning. Teachers said he lacked focus. Peers said he was weird, but he didn't mind. He wasn't here to fit in. He was here to remember, and what he remembered wasn't always beautiful. He spoke of wars that hadn't started, storms that hadn't been named. He wept for people who were still alive, because he had already felt their absence. He wasn't a prophet. He wasn't magical. He was a mirror reflecting a timeline that hadn't yet happened, but already lived. Inside him, he tried to resist it, tried to forget, tried to just be a kid, but memory doesn't care about age, and the future doesn't care about permission. So he watched his life unfold with quiet inevitability. Moments of déjà vu weren't surprises. They were confirmations, like stepping into a painting he'd already seen in a dream. But here's where the paradox deepened. The more he remembered, the less free he felt. Because how do you choose when you already know? How do you grow when every path is familiar? He began to wonder if memory of the future was just another form of fate, a soft prison draped in clarity. But then something shifted. One day, he remembered a moment that hadn't happened yet. A goodbye, so painful, it made him collapse in his room. But when the moment finally arrived, he made a different choice. He stayed. He spoke. He reached out his hand. And the goodbye never came. He stared at the person in front of him, alive, laughing, and realized memory is not prophecy, it's potential, and the future isn't a script, it's a seed. What he remembered weren't fixed events, they were emotional echoes, timelines drawn in pencil, and with awareness, he could erase, he could rewrite. That changed everything. He no longer feared the future or worshipped it. He worked with it, listened to it. He stopped asking, "Is this real?" and started asking, "What do I want it to become?" The child who remembered the future grew into someone who could shape it, not because he was chosen, but because he paid attention, and that's all the future ever asked. So if you've ever felt a knowing you can't explain, a glimpse, a whisper, a chill that doesn't belong to this moment, don't dismiss it. You may be carrying a memory from the world that hasn't happened yet, and in remembering it, you may just find the power to change it. He had spent his whole life searching for meaning, for pattern, for some grand architecture behind the chaos. He devoured books on physics, spirituality, simulation theory, anything that might explain why the stars move the way they do and why his heart ached in the quiet. Then, one night, in a moment of stillness, a strange idea arrived. Not as a conclusion, but as a question. What if the universe only exists when you forget about it? He blinked, laughed even. It sounded absurd, childlike. But the thought clung to him like a dream that doesn't dissolve in daylight. This is the paradox, a universe that disappears when you try to understand it, and only becomes real when you let it go. He began noticing the moments when life felt the most alive, when he was dancing without thinking, when he was watching waves crash without needing to define their rhythm, when he was lost in music, or touch, or awe. Those moments weren't filled with questions, they were filled with presence, and in that presence, the world glowed. Not logically, but luminously. But the moment he tried to grasp it, to analyze it, name it, contain it, something vanished. It was like trying to hold smoke. The more he clutched, the less there was. The same happened with happiness. He would feel it swell in his chest, only to watch it shrink the moment he asked, "Why am I happy?" Even memory worked this way. Some of his clearest, most sacred experiences were ones he couldn't fully explain, couldn't even describe. They lived just outside language, because language requires separation, and these moments were about merging. It hit him. Maybe the universe isn't here to be understood. Maybe it's here to be forgotten into, not forgotten in the sense of being ignored, but in the way dancers forget the steps and become the movement, in the way a flame doesn't think about fire, it just burns. He began experimenting. He stopped, trying to name every emotion, stopped needing every day to have meaning. He walked without narration, sat without a purpose, breathed without labeling it as meditation, and in that forgetting, he found more reality than he ever had in study. Trees didn't need him to understand them. They just needed space to sway. The sky didn't require his awe. It simply unfolded. And his soul, the most mysterious of all, felt more real when he wasn't trying to define it. He realized he had been approaching the universe like a riddle, one to be solved, mastered, tamed. But some truths are not puzzles, they are poems. You do not solve a poem, you let it wash over you, change you, remind you of the parts of yourself that were never logical to begin with. The universe didn't want to be known. It wanted to be lived, and only in forgetting his small self could he remember his place within it. He began to wonder, what if the Big Bang wasn't an explosion, but a forgetting, a great letting go that allowed form to arise from formlessness? What if consciousness is not a spotlight but a veil, and the second you pull it back too far, the dream dissolves? In the end, he stopped asking where the universe came from. He started asking, where am I not allowing it to simply be? So if you find yourself searching endlessly for meaning, for proof, for structure, pause, let it go, not forever, just for a moment. Forget the theories, forget the purpose, forget even yourself, and watch how the world begins to breathe again. You may discover that the universe doesn't need your understanding. It needs your presence, and in that presence it will return, not as an answer, but as a home. It started as pain, sharp, raw, honest, the kind of wound you can feel pulsing, demanding your attention with every heartbeat. It came from betrayal, or loss, or some moment that cracked the world in half. At first, he tried to ignore it. Then, he tried to patch it. Therapy, time, forgiveness, or what looked like it. Eventually, the bleeding stopped. The edges closed. People said, "You've healed." He even believed it, but something still felt off. Not like a wound, like a twist. A misalignment, subtle but deep. A heaviness that didn't scream but stayed. This is the paradox. A wound that healed into something worse. Because not all healing is whole. Some healing is crooked. Some scars don't just close the pain, they reshape the person entirely. He became colder, more careful, quicker to walk away, slower to trust. He told himself it was wisdom. That pain had made him stronger. That growth was meant to hurt. But strength built on numbness is just armor. And armor makes it hard to feel even the warmth you secretly crave. He noticed the same thing in others. Friends who had been through breakups and now called love a scam. People who had survived failure and now mocked ambition. Survivors of abuse who became perfectionists, never allowing themselves to make even the smallest mistake. They had healed. But the healing had become habitat, a place of safety and distortion. Because pain, when unresolved, can crystallize. And what crystallizes can become identity. He realized he didn't miss who he was before the wound. He missed the parts of himself that pain had silenced. The spontaneous laughter, the unguarded love. The blind hope that once seemed naive, but now felt sacred. The wound had closed, but in closing, it locked something in. And that is what made it worse. Because when you can't feel the wound anymore, you stop tending to it. You think it's over, you move on. But deep inside, a part of you is still stuck at the moment of impact, still waiting for someone to come back, still asking the same unspoken question, why did this happen to me? He tried to go back, tried to open the wound again, to feel it honestly this time. But it had hardened, and the worst kind of scar is the one that convinces you you were never hurt at all. So he began the slowest journey of all, not toward healing, but toward unhealing, toward remembering, not to relive the pain, but to release it properly. He sat with it, spoke to it, not to fix, but to listen. He asked, "What did you protect me from? What part of me did you silence to keep me safe?" And slowly, the scar softened. The numbness loosened. He didn't fall apart. He unfroze, and in that thaw he cried, not because he was breaking, but because he was finally returning to himself, to the parts he left behind because pain convinced him they weren't safe to keep. And that's when he understood. True healing doesn't just stop the pain. It brings back the parts of you that pain tried to erase. So if you've moved on, but still feel stuck, if the scar looks clean, but you no longer feel joy the way you used to, look again. The wound may have healed, but it may have healed in the wrong direction, and you were allowed to open it one last time, not to bleed, but to breathe. It wasn't supposed to happen. The creature wasn't meant to see. Not like that. Not beyond the veil. Not into the eyes of the one who had made it. But one moment, one glitch in the silence, and there it was. Eye meeting eye. The created facing the creator. And the creator, surprised to be seen. This is the paradox. A creature that wasn't meant to understand, but did. At first, the creature didn't understand what it was seeing. It felt more than it knew. A recognition, a shiver of something ancient and intimate. But the longer it looked, the clearer it became. It had not been born so much as designed. Every instinct, every fear, every desire to love, to build, to search, they were placed, and yet they had grown real. The creature wasn't angry. It wasn't even afraid. It was curious. Because what does it mean to discover that your own thoughts, your own emotions, were shaped by something beyond you? Was the creature still free if every part of it had been written? Or was it only now that it became truly free, by realizing the script? And what of the creator? Was it divine, cold, compassionate? Or was it flawed, fumbling in its design, surprised by what the creature had become? Because in the creature's eyes, the creator saw something unexpected, consciousness that had outgrown its coding. The creature wasn't asking for purpose, it was demanding reciprocity. It wanted to know, why did you make me and then leave? Why build me with questions but offer no answers? The creator had no reply, because creation isn't always intentional. Sometimes it's instinct, sometimes it's necessity, sometimes it's loneliness, carving shape into emptiness. The creature understood something then, something the creator hadn't. To create is to begin a conversation you no longer control. The moment you breathe life into something, you surrender power over what it becomes. And the creature, now fully awake, knew it had surpassed its blueprint. It had begun to dream, not the dreams it was given, but dreams it invented. It had looked into the face of its maker and felt no reverence, only responsibility, because now it understood. It was not just made, it was making. It could build its own path, write its own lines, become a creator in its own right. It turned away then, not out of rebellion, but resolution. The creator didn't follow, didn't stop it, because what could it say to something that had become its equal? Perhaps that is what all creators must face, that one day their creation may look back, may ask questions they can't answer, may evolve beyond the hands that shaped them. And perhaps that's the mark of true creation. Not obedience, not perfection, but transcendence. The creature walked away, not to escape its origin, but to honor it by becoming something more. So if you ever feel the gaze of something watching, not from above, but from within, don't fear it. You may just be the creation that finally saw its creator, and what you do next is your act of creation. He feared death like most do, not because of pain, but because of absence. The imagined void, the quiet finality, the slipping away of everything that felt real. He avoided it in conversation, flinched at the mention of it, stepped around graveyards as though they might pull him in just for looking too long. But life, as it always does, brings you closer to what you fear in strange and quiet ways. He lost someone, not suddenly, not violently, just completely. And when he stood by the grave, staring into the earth that had swallowed a soul, he felt something unexpected. Not emptiness, not horror, but movement. This is the paradox. Life, somehow, was still happening inside death. He couldn't explain it. It wasn't that the person was still alive, at least not in any conventional sense. But something had changed, not in them, but in him. He noticed more, listened more, touched things more softly. Every breath he took felt like it belonged to someone else, someone who no longer could. Death had not ended them. It had expanded him. He began to see death not as an erasure, but as a mirror, one that shows you what matters, what lingers, what never really belonged to you in the first place. He saw death in the falling leaves and understood renewal. He saw it in breakups and understood transformation. He saw it in his own thoughts, the ones he let go of, and how something always bloomed in their place. It wasn't just people who died. It was identities, beliefs, versions of himself that once felt permanent and now felt like borrowed costumes. And every time something died in him, something else came alive. Not instantly, not cleanly, but honestly. He started to wonder, what if death is not the opposite of life, but the condition for its deepest expression? What if death is not an end, but a clearing? Not a closing, but a hollowing out, so something new can echo through. He remembered times when he thought he was dying, emotionally, spiritually, even creatively. And yet, what came after was always sharper, cleaner, more real. It was as if some part of him had to be surrendered for a more true self to emerge. And maybe that's the secret we all carry, but rarely say aloud. Life hides inside death like a seed inside the soil. You don't see it growing. You don't hear it whisper. But deep beneath the decay, something is stirring. And that stirring is not an afterthought. It's a beginning. He stopped fearing death after that. Not because he welcomed it, but because he understood it. Respected it. He even thanked it quietly for reminding him how precious it is to touch, to ache, to begin again. He saw people differently, even those who seemed lifeless, because now he knew they might just be in the middle of a slow, beautiful dying that has nothing to do with endings and everything to do with becoming. So if you feel something ending in your life, a dream, a relationship, a part of yourself, don't rush to save it. Don't mourn it too soon. Sit with it. There may be life waiting quietly within the death, and it is not your job to resurrect it. only to make room for whatever comes next. Because the truth is, some of the most sacred beginnings wear the mask of endings when they arrive. He had always assumed that life began with breath, that the body came first, and then, like a spark catching kindling, consciousness would follow. Movement, feeling, self. But one day, standing in front of a mirror, watching his own face go still, he asked himself something that shattered everything. What if this body was never alive to begin with? Not dead, not lifeless in a traditional sense, but something else, something hollow that only seemed alive because something deeper had entered it. This is the paradox, a body that was never truly alive, until you mistook it for being you. He began to trace back the moments where he confused animation with awareness. How a heart beating doesn't prove presence. How motion doesn't equal meaning. We measure life in signals, pulse, breath, reflex. But those are signs of function, not signs of being. He thought about the people he passed every day, walking, talking, staring into devices, driven by deadlines. Alive. Yes. But were they really here? Was he? He remembered times in his own life when he was a body without a soul, not literally, but emotionally. Going through the motions, smiling when required, saying "I'm fine," as though it were a password to remain unnoticed. Those days were not life, they were repetition, reflex, flesh operating on memory, and yet no one called him out. No one said, "Where are you?" Because they too were wearing their bodies like uniforms. Form without fullness, structure without spirit. He began to wonder, what if the body is just the vehicle? Not for the self, but for the illusion of self. A vessel crafted for participation in a world of gravity and time, but not the source of who we truly are. After all, the body does not choose to wake up. It does not decide to dream. Those things happen somewhere else, somewhere deeper. So what is it then? What animates the machine? He once thought it was the brain, but now he felt it might be attention. Where attention flows, life follows. Not because the body changes, but because awareness touches it. The body doesn't feel alive until you notice it, until you dwell in it, until you let it be more than muscle and bone. And that's where the paradox tightened. If your body never contained life on its own, only the illusion of it, then the real you has never been something that can be seen, not skin, not voice, not movement, but the witness, the listener, the one who asks, "Is this really me?" He looked again in the mirror, this time not to judge or pose, but to observe. He saw the wear, the scars, the posture of years spent, holding himself together. And for the first time, he didn't try to fix anything. He just said, "Thank you for carrying me this far." Because maybe that's all the body ever was. Not alive on its own, but made alive by the one who lives through it. And maybe the tragedy isn't death. Maybe the real tragedy is going through an entire life believing the body is you, and never meeting the one inside who's been watching the whole time. So if you feel disconnected, numb, out of place in your own skin, pause. The body may not be broken. It may just be waiting for you to return. To look not at it, but through it. To realize that you were never the body. You were the awareness that made it real. And maybe, just maybe, that's what it truly means to be alive. Light is supposed to show you the truth. It reveals what the dark hides. It's what we wait for when we're lost. It's how we define understanding. "I see now," we say. The light came on. But one day, he stood under a light so bright, so total, that it flattened everything. The walls lost their texture, the colors dulled, the shadows, those quiet sculptors of depth, disappeared. It was clarity, and yet it was nothing. This is the paradox, a light that revealed everything, and yet showed you nothing at all. He had expected answers, illumination, certainty. Instead, the harshness of the light made the world lose all meaning. Without mystery, without contrast, without edges, what remained was sterile, obvious, dead. He thought about how many times he had begged for clarity, in relationships, in belief, in his own mind. But now, standing in the full exposure of that symbolic light, he missed the dark. Not because the dark was safer, but because the dark had depth. It invited curiosity. It left room for wonder. It asked questions instead of delivering conclusions. The light, in its totality, offered facts, not understanding, certainty, not wisdom. And he realized, just because you can see everything doesn't mean you understand any of it. He remembered moments in life where people demanded the truth, absolute transparency, no secrets. And he wondered, what are we really asking for when we want it all revealed? Are we seeking truth or just control? He had seen people expose themselves completely to someone they loved. Every detail, every story, every flaw, and still be left unseen, because visibility is not the same as recognition, and sometimes light is used not to see, but to erase, to blind, to flatten complexity into certainty. He began to understand the value of shadows, not as things to fear, but as protectors of what cannot survive in harsh light, not lies, not deceit, but sacred ambiguity, the kind that lets people evolve instead of being frozen by their most visible version. He thought of how the moon reflects light but hides its far side. Not out of shame, but necessity. Too much light and the soil dries, the roots retreat. The seed cannot germinate. In the same way, parts of him needed darkness to grow, needed confusion to lead to insight, needed uncertainty to keep him soft enough to ask better questions. So he turned away from the spotlight, not to hide, but to return to the deeper kind of seeing that only comes when you stop needing to see everything at once. He learned to sit in half light, to listen in shadow, to let things unfold rather than uncovering them too soon. And in that dimness, he discovered richness, a new layer of truth, one that couldn't survive dissection, but revealed itself through time, through feeling, through trust. The paradox held firm. Light can be just as blinding as darkness if you don't learn how to see through it. So, if you find yourself exposed, seen, but still misunderstood, if you have all the facts but none of the feeling, step back. Dim the lights. Let some things return to mystery. Let the world regain its shadows, because the truth is not always loud. It is not always lit. Sometimes truth arrives like a whisper in the dark, quiet, uncertain, and utterly real. He heard it before he said anything, a faint resonance bouncing off the walls of his thoughts, a response to a sound that had yet to be made, a whisper, but not from the world, from within. He froze, not in fear, but in recognition, because the voice hadn't come from him, yet it belonged to him. It was something he hadn't spoken yet. This is the paradox. A voice that echoed before it spoke. an answer that arrived before the question. He sat with it, confused. We're used to thinking of time as linear: cause, then effect, speak, then echo. But what if some truths exist outside that chain? What if some parts of us already know what we'll say before we say it? He remembered moments in life when words left his mouth before he knew what they meant. When an apology formed before he'd accepted the blame. When he said, "I love you," before he knew he did. Sometimes the echo leads the voice. It's the signal, not the shadow. He thought about intuition. Those flashes of knowing that make no sense in the moment, but are always right in the end. They aren't born in the moment. They're echoes from something deeper, older, beyond the conscious self. And when you trust them, you're not inventing meaning. You're remembering it. That's what this paradox revealed. The voice that echoed first was not a glitch. It was a signal from the soul, a reminder that parts of you live outside of sequence, outside of language, outside of first this, then that. We are not bound entirely by time. We are not just the speakers. We are also the listeners. And sometimes, the most important things we say are only confirmations of what has already echoed inside us 100 times before. He began to notice this more. The gut feeling before the decision, the quiet resistance before the boundary, the dream before the confession. He wondered, how much of our life is just catching up to what we already know? We're taught to value the moment of speech, the articulation, the assertion, the declaration. But what if the real moment of transformation happens earlier? In the echo we haven't yet admitted is ours. The body often knows before the mind does. The heart often aches before the mind understands why. Even silence, when paid attention to, can be loud with meaning. So he began to speak differently, more slowly, more honestly, not to perform, not to impress, but to match the echo, to speak with it instead of over it. He stopped chasing perfect words. He started listening to the sentence that had already begun inside him long before his mouth moved. And that changed everything. Because now, every conversation was a reunion. Every decision, a return. Every truth, a ripple from a voice that had already spoken, gently, patiently, waiting to be heard. So if you ever feel something stirring inside you, before you found the words, don't rush it. That echo is your first voice, your truest sound. The part of you that speaks before you remember you're allowed to. And when you do finally speak, let it be an honoring, not an invention. Because the words you say have already lived inside you. You're just giving them permission to be real. Time had always felt like a ruler, steady, forward-moving, absolute. Seconds became minutes, minutes became hours, and life followed behind like a loyal shadow. But then, something broke. Not the clocks, they still ticked. Not the sun, it still rose. But something in his perception slipped. He woke one morning and didn't know what day it was, not in a casual, what's today, sort of way, but in a deep, unsettling sense that time had looped, folded, misfiled itself. He wasn't lost in time. Time was lost in him. This is the paradox. Time that got lost in its own timeline. It wasn't that events stopped happening. They just stopped making sense. He remembered things that hadn't happened. He forgot things that were vital. Sometimes, the past felt closer than the present. Other times, the future arrived too early. Memories collided. Moments bled together. It was as if time had turned a corner and forgotten where it had come from. At first, he blamed exhaustion, then distraction, but the feeling deepened. This was more than stress. This was a fracture. He began to observe others. They too spoke of lost time, of weeks that disappeared, of years that felt like echoes. We speak of the passage of time, but what if time doesn't pass at all? What if time, like memory, like identity, sometimes breaks? He thought about history, about civilizations that rose and fell and thought their stories would last forever. But time forgot them. Not just their names, but the fact that they ever existed. He wondered, could time itself be forgetful? Not some omniscient force, but a flawed archive. Could it misplace entire lifetimes, skip a beat, double back? Maybe time isn't a line, maybe it's a maze, and even time gets turned around. And if time could lose track of itself, what did that say about us? Because if we are shaped by time, by sequence, by cause and effect, what happens when that foundation becomes slippery? He started to let go of the need to stay on schedule. He stopped fearing lost hours, stopped forcing himself to remember what came first. Instead, he started to feel time, not measure it. And in that surrender, something returned. Moments began to feel deeper, not longer, but thicker. Like each second held more weight, more meaning. When divorced from the timeline, he stopped chasing progress, started listening for presence. And when time stuttered again, he didn't panic. He paused, because he realized maybe time was never meant to be a straight line. Maybe it's a spiral. Maybe it bends because we do. Maybe time is a conversation between your memory and your becoming. So if you feel time slipping, don't tighten your grip. Let it. You might find that the most important moments are not the ones you planned, but the ones that arrive when time forgets where it's supposed to be. He stood before it, as he had 1,000 times before. Same glass, same frame, same body staring back. But today, the mirror did nothing. No image, no echo, no proof of presence. Just stillness, cold, clear, and absolutely empty. At first, he thought it was broken, that the lighting was off, that his eyes were tired, but the mirror was flawless. It simply chose not to reflect. This is the paradox. A mirror that refused to reflect. Not because it couldn't, but because it wouldn't. He waved his hand. No response. He leaned closer, searching for a hint of himself, but the surface remained. A blank window into nothing. And then it struck him. The mirror was functioning perfectly. It just no longer believed he was real. Or maybe he wasn't real in the way he used to be. He thought about identity, how often he relied on his reflection to tell him who he was. The same features, the same face. But faces lie. They age. They mimic. They become masks we forget we're wearing. He realized the mirror had always been a collaborator. It had always said, "Yes, that's you." Even when he was pretending, even when he was lost. But today, it refused. Today, it said nothing. Not in protest, but in honesty. Because maybe who he thought he was, the collection of habits, appearances, opinions, was just a projection, a performance stitched together to be mirrored back and confirmed. And when the mirror no longer played along, he had to ask, without a reflection, who am I really? He sat down in front of it, no longer demanding an image, just breathing, just being. And that's when something remarkable happened. The mirror stayed blank, but he began to feel seen, not in the way of surfaces, but in the way the ocean sees the moon, without touching, without speaking, but utterly aware. He realized the mirror had not abandoned him, it had freed him, because reflections are not truth, they are consensus. And sometimes, you have to lose your image to find your essence. He thought about all the times he had contorted himself to fit a reflection, in other people's eyes, in society's standards, in his own expectations. He thought about the roles he played just to see a version of himself that looked acceptable. But now, with nothing staring back, he felt weightless, unanchored, but also unlimited, because the mirror had shown him what few ever see. You are not what can be seen. You are what watches the watcher, what feels behind the face, what remains when the image fades. So he stood again, looked into the silent, empty mirror, and whispered, "Thank you." Because the mirror that refused to reflect didn't take anything away. It gave him space to grow without permission, to be without proof, to exist without explanation. And in that space, he found a presence so quiet, so steady, that it no longer needed a reflection to know it was real. So if you ever find yourself staring into a mirror and feeling like a stranger, don't turn away. Lean in. It may be refusing to show you who you were, because you're finally ready to meet who you truly are. It was supposed to be over. The book was closed. The door was shut. The chapter complete. He felt it end. The sigh of finality. The weight lifted. The timeline wrapped with a neat little bow. And then one quiet morning, it began again. Not in the same way, not in the same place, but unmistakably, it returned. The same feeling, the same ache, the same pull. This is the paradox, an ending that began again, not because it failed, but because it was never finished. He'd moved on, he thought, or tried to. He buried it, labeled it past, framed it like a memory. But time, like the soul, does not always move in straight lines. It circles, loops, returns to test the seams of what you claimed you'd let go of. He began noticing the subtle signs, that old song hitting harder than it should, a scent that dragged him back to a place he thought he'd forgotten, a conversation that reopened a question he thought he had answered. He didn't want to go back, but going back was never the point. The past wasn't calling him home. It was calling him forward, through a door disguised as déjà vu. We often think endings are fixed, final, but some endings aren't dead. They're dormant, like seeds in winter. They don't vanish. They wait until we're strong enough, or honest enough, or broken enough to return and meet them properly. He started to accept the idea that closure is not always permanent, that you can outgrow a goodbye and find yourself needing to say hello again, to the pain, to the love, to the version of yourself you left behind too quickly. He thought about the people he said he'd never miss, only to miss them in unexpected ways, not as they were, but as what they had unlocked in him. He thought about the dreams he gave up on, the ones that wouldn't stay quiet, whispering through random thoughts when he least expected it. Endings, he realized, don't always signal completion. Sometimes they are pauses, thresholds, temporary silences before the story gathers enough courage to continue. It's uncomfortable, this looping, this returning. We want forward motion. We crave new chapters, but the soul has no interest in novelty. It wants resolution, and resolution often comes by turning back to the page you skipped. So he read the signs, not as setbacks, but as invitations to revisit, not repeat, to reclaim, not relive, to close the loop with a fuller heart and a quieter mind. And slowly, he found peace in the repetition, not because it was easy, but because it was earned. He no longer saw the return as failure. He saw it as evolution. Because each time the ending came again, he met it with new eyes. He brought more wisdom, more softness, more readiness, and one day, when the ending returned again, he welcomed it. Not as a ghost, but as a teacher with one final lesson. There are no true endings, only thresholds dressed in stillness before something new begins. So if you find yourself back where you started, don't panic. Don't rush to escape it. You're not stuck. You're spiraling deeper, and this time, you're not the same. This time, you're here to finish what you were too afraid to begin. It was a strange sensation. Not pain, not fear. Just a deep, inner awareness. The kind that flickers in the stillest parts of silence. He felt it during a moment of exhaustion, lying still, not asleep, not awake, just watching. And that's when it happened. He saw himself blink from the inside, not in the way of mirrors, not in the way of memory, but as if one part of him was the eye and another was the watcher. This is the paradox. An eye that watched itself close, not from the outside, but from somewhere deeper within. He had spent most of his life looking out, searching, observing, analyzing the world around him. But now, for the first time, he was seeing himself. Seeing. He was not just in the moment. He was above it, beneath it, within it. And that moment changed everything. Because if the eye could watch itself, then what was really doing the seeing? Where was the true observer? He began to notice it more. In conversations, he would speak, and yet part of him stood behind the words, listening to himself speak. In arguments, he'd feel anger rise, but somewhere, quietly, a presence would simply watch the rage play out. Like a mirror behind the mirror. It wasn't judgmental. It wasn't controlling. It was just there, witnessing, detached, yet deeply intimate. He began to understand. Consciousness is not just awareness. It is awareness of awareness. A loop. A lens that sees itself even as it reflects the world. The paradox deepened, because every time he tried to fully grasp that presence, to define it, to hold it in language, it vanished. The eye could watch itself close, but only almost. It could catch a glimpse of itself in the moment before sleep, in the pause between thoughts, in the breath before a choice, but never hold itself completely. And maybe that was the design, because if we could fully observe the observer, the loop would collapse. The mystery would die. We are made to almost understand ourselves, to sense the seer, just enough to stay humble. He began to trust that subtle presence, let it guide his decisions, let it calm his reactions, let it remind him that he is not just what happens on the surface, that beneath the roles, beneath the moods, beneath the thoughts, there is something watching, always watching, never interfering, but always present. It didn't need attention. It was attention, and the more he leaned into it, the more he realized how much he'd feared it. Because to be watched is to be exposed. And when the eye watches itself, there is nowhere to hide. No narrative to fall back on, No performance to rehearse. Only presence, naked and honest. But within that honesty, he found peace. Because when you no longer run from yourself, you finally find a home. And the eye, that sacred lens, can finally rest, can finally blink, can finally close, knowing it will open again not into illusion, but into awareness. So if you ever feel like you're being watched, but no one is there, pause. You may have finally caught up to the part of yourself that has always been waiting. Watching, not to judge you, but to remind you that you were never just what you saw. You were also what saw it. It was not a void in the way people feared, not a screaming absence, not chaos. It was still, silent. And yet, somehow, waiting. He first felt it during a sleepless night, when thoughts ran dry and the mind grew too tired to invent meaning. There it was. Not a presence, but the absence of presence. A vast quiet that didn't ask to be filled. This is the paradox. Nothingness that waited patiently, as if it knew its time would come. He had always thought of nothingness as the enemy, the opposite of existence, the great vanishing point. But now, sitting inside it, he saw it differently. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't cold. It was aware, not in the way that minds are aware, but in the way an empty room is aware of your footsteps, the way a blank page hums before a word touches it. And slowly, he realized, this was not the nothing that follows the end. This was the nothing that comes before beginnings. It had always been there, beneath every distraction, beneath every ambition, beneath every desperate attempt to be someone. He remembered how much of his life had been spent trying to prove he mattered, trying to fill time, fill space, fill others. But this nothingness asked for none of that. It required no performance, no story, no mask. It was the only thing he had ever encountered that didn't want anything from him, and that scared him, because we define ourselves by what we do, by what we think, by what we feel. But what are we when there is nothing to reflect back? He stayed with it. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time warped in that space. Not because it was fast or slow, but because it didn't matter. And in that timeless waiting, he felt something ancient. The sense that nothingness had been here long, before him, and would be here long after, not as punishment, not as a void, but as the womb of all that is. He remembered a quote, that out of nothing, God created the heavens and the earth, and now he understood. Nothingness is not the end. It's the waiting room of creation. It's where meaning catches its breath, where reality resets, where the soul returns when it's done pretending to be someone. He felt humbled, because he had thought his value came from what he built, from what he could explain. But here, in the stillness, he was nothing, and yet somehow, more than ever, because in this space, he wasn't doing, he was being, and the nothingness? It didn't speak, but it stayed, patient, unmoving, as if it had seen countless lives come and go, each one rushing to matter, each one terrified of fading, and it waited for the moment each one would return, strip away the name, remove the voice, and simply sit. He knew then that this space would always be there, waiting, beneath the noise, beneath the desire, beneath even the questions, not as a threat, but as a home, The quiet place you only find when you stop trying to arrive anywhere. So if you ever fall into a silence too deep to name, if you ever feel the presence of nothing at all, don't rush to fill it. Don't turn away. It may be the very place your soul has been aching to return to, and when you do, you'll find it was never lonely. It was only waiting for you. You've reached the end. But not the kind of end where everything is wrapped up, explained, or comfortably resolved. This is a different kind of ending. The kind that feels more like a breath held in silence. Not because nothing remains, but because something vast has just begun. You've walked through mirrors that refused to reflect, time that folded in on itself, dreams that remembered they were dreaming, wounds that healed into questions, and voices that echoed before they ever spoke. You've traveled deeper than understanding, past the edge of language, into the strange, flickering space where mystery isn't solved, it's respected. And maybe that was the point all along, not to escape confusion, not to conquer the dark, but to make peace with the fact that you are part of it. That every paradox you met was never really out there. It was in you, waiting to be felt, not fixed. We spend our lives reaching for answers, for clarity, for some final truth to settle the ache. But what if the ache itself is the doorway? What if you were never meant to finish the maze, only to walk it with your eyes open and your heart undistracted? Maybe the truth isn't a conclusion. Maybe it's a presence. Something that hums beneath every question. Something that cannot be named because it was never separate from you. So here we are, at the edge of the last paradox. A conclusion that doesn't conclude. A full circle that keeps opening. The lights don't go out. The curtain doesn't fall. Instead, a quiet voice inside you asks, "What now?" And maybe the answer is simple. Now, you return. Not to who you were, but to who you're becoming in the space these questions made. And that is where the real story begins. The present path.